Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The first sound was not a scream, nor a whisper from the dark, but the precise, metronomic click of a plastic gear. It came from within a small, battery-powered skeleton that danced on the windowsill, a cheap decoration bought from a discount store bin. In the deep silence of the October night, its jerky, endless jig was the only movement, the only noise. Click-clack, click-clack. Leonard Miller, awake in the blue glow of 3 a.m., watched it from the kitchen table, his knuckles white around a mug of cold coffee. He found its ceaseless rhythm more unnerving than any sudden noise. It was a sound of mechanism, of something pretending to be alive, and in the stillness of his own house, it felt like a countdown. His daughter, Lucia, had started the countdown 7 days before Halloween. It began subtly, as these things often do, disguised in the festive trappings of the season. The Miller family lived on Hemlock Lane, a street that took its Halloween duties seriously. By October 24th, the suburb was a riot of orange and black. Porches were lined with grinning, leering, and sorrowful jack-o'-lanterns, their candle-lit souls casting long, dancing shadows that made the very sidewalks seem to writhe. Synthetic cobwebs, glittering with dew, clung to every shrub and mailbox. Plastic skeletons hung from porch eaves, and in the gathering twilight, it was sometimes difficult to tell which bones were fake. The air itself was a potion of scents. The waxy, vegetal smell of scooped pumpkin guts, the sweet, spicy ghost of cinnamon and nutmeg from kitchen windows, and beneath it all, the faint, fungal odor of decay, of leaves turning to mulch in the rain-soaked earth. Lucia, 15, had thrown herself into the decorations with an uncharacteristic fervor. She was the one who had spent an entire Saturday carving a dozen pumpkins, her hands slick with stringy pulp and seeds. She carved intricate, unsettling faces, not the simple triangles of childhood, but gaunt, starved visages with knowing smiles and eyes that seemed to follow you. One, in particular, she placed on the stump of the old oak in their front yard. It had no mouth, only a single, spiraling hole in its forehead. When asked about it, she simply said, "It's listening." The change in her was first noted by her younger brother, Harry. He was 12, an age poised between the magic of trick-or-treating and the cynicism of adolescence. He noticed that Lucia had stopped listening to her usual music, the frantic pop and angsty rock, and had taken to sitting in her room in silence, or with the window open, listening to the rustle of the cornfield that backed onto their property. "She smells different," he told his father, Leonard, "like old leaves and cold air." Leonard and his wife, Joel, initially dismissed it as teenage moodiness, amplified by the spooky atmosphere. Joel, a practical woman with a mathematician-esque mind, attributed it to hormones and stress. Leonard, a quieter, more intuitive man, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the window frames. He saw the way Lucia would sometimes stare at her reflection in the black kitchen window at night, her face a pale moon floating in the darkness, her expression not one of vanity, but of cold appraisal. Then came the sleepwalking. Harry was the first to witness it. He woke to the sound of his door creaking open. Lucia stood there, silhouetted by the hall light, wearing the antique porcelain doll mask she found at a thrift store. Her body was rigid. "The corn is hungry," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "It wants to wear a new face." Then she turned and walked back to her room. Harry lay frozen until dawn, the words etched into his mind, more terrifying than any monster from a movie. The incidents escalated as Halloween drew nearer. Lucia would speak in fragments of languages no one could identify, a guttural, clicking tongue that sounded like stones grinding together. She developed an aversion to anything blessed or sacred, flinching away from the small cross their cleaning lady wore, her skin rising in welts where the silver had nearly touched her. One afternoon, Joel found her in the basement, surrounded by the Family S vintage Halloween decorations, cardboard witches, and blow-mold black cats from the 1950s. Lucia was arranging them in a circle, and in the center, she had drawn a complex symbol on the concrete floor, using the black, desiccated innards of a rotted pumpkin. "He is coming through the door in the sky," she said, not looking up. Her voice was flat, a recording. "The Lord of the fallen fruits, the King of the rotting harvest." Desperation led them to the church. Father Andrew, a young priest with a modern sensibility and a shadow of doubt in his eyes, came to the house. He listened to their story in the living room, the cheerful glow of a grinning jack-o'-lantern on the porch visible through the window. He tried to speak to Lucia, who was curled in an armchair, staring at the dancing skeleton on the sill. Click-clack, click-clack. "Lucia," the priest began, his voice gentle. "Can you tell me what is happening?" She turned her head slowly. Her eyes, usually a warm brown, looked flat and dark, like old paint. "The mask is not for hiding," she said. "It is for becoming. And mine is almost finished." Father Andrew left looking pale and unsettled. "I don't know," he confessed to Leonard on the porch, the autumn wind plucking at his coat. "It could be a profound psychological break, the power of suggestion amplified by the season, or it could be something else, something older. The church requires extensive evaluation before it will even consider an intervention." He promised to make calls to seek guidance, but the process was slow, and Halloween was only 3 days away. It was then that the media found them. A producer for a reality television show called Paranormal Witness caught wind of the story, a teenage girl in a perfect American suburb, possibly possessed, right before Halloween. It was ratings gold. A van arrived, and a small crew, led by a slick, ambitious woman named Mara, descended upon Hemlock Lane. They brought cameras and microphones, and a cynical energy that felt more invasive than any spirit. Leonard, drowning in medical bills and terrified for his daughter, saw a desperate opportunity. The show offered money, a lot of it enough for the best doctors, for any kind of help. Joel was vehemently opposed, her face a mask of fury and betrayal. "They are vampires, Leonard. They will feed on our daughter's suffering." But Leonard, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep, saw no other path. He signed the contract. The house became a circus. Cameras followed Lucia S. every vacant stare. Microphones picked up her whispered, alien words. Mara coached the family, suggesting they play up the Halloween angle. "Can you have more pumpkins carved? The weirder the better. And Harry, maybe you can look more scared when you talk about the sleepwalking." The line between truth and performance began to blur, smudged by the glare of the lights and the promise of a solution. Harry felt the world tilting. His sister was a stranger, his parents were at war, and his home was no longer his own. He sought refuge in the one place the cameras didn't go: the cornfield. The stalks were brittle and brown, their dry rustle a constant, whispering conversation. He would walk the narrow paths, the sky a narrow strip of gray above him, and feel a dreadful certainty that the maze was shifting behind him, that the scarecrow posted at the Field S center, a lanky figure in a tattered flannel shirt, was never facing the same direction twice. On the eve of Halloween, the tension broke. Lucia, provoked by a cameraman who got too close, erupted. The air in the room grew cold, a palpable chill that frosted the windows. Furniture slid across the floor without being touched. Lucia's body contorted, arching backwards until it seemed her spine must snap. And from her mouth came a voice that was a chorus of rot and ruin, a sound of 1,000 pumpkins splitting open, of leaves crumbling to dust. "The veil tears tonight," it boomed. "The door is open. We have been invited by the light and the grin." The camera crew, for the first time, looked truly terrified. Mara, however, had a glint of triumph in her eyes. This was the money shot. Father Andrew returned that night, summoned by a frantic Joel. He brought holy water and a stole, his faith now a hard, cold stone in his gut. The exorcism, if that's what it was, began in Lucia S. bedroom, now a chaotic blend of teenage girl and charnel house. The cameras rolled, their red lights like the eyes of watching insects. It was a brutal, hours-long struggle. Leonard and Joel held their daughter down as she thrashed, her strength superhuman. Father Andrew recited the rites, his voice rising above her guttural screams and the blasphemous, laughing replies. The room stank of ozone and spoiled meat. A framed poster of a pop star shattered. The plastic skeleton on the windowsill danced faster, its click-clack a frantic, mocking rhythm to the holy words. Harry watched from the doorway, his world reduced to this single, horrifying room. He saw the struggle not as a battle between good and evil, but as a violent, desperate act of love against an incomprehensible emptiness. He saw the media crew capturing it all, their faces a mixture of fear and grotesque fascination. He saw his family being torn apart, not by a demon, but by the very act of trying to save itself. As the clock ticked towards midnight, the climax came. Lucia's body went rigid. She pointed a trembling finger not at the cross, but but at the window, at the dark cornfield beyond. "The harvester is here," the voice snarled. "He reaps the masked SOULS." And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Lucia collapsed, breathing deeply, sweat-soaked and still. The oppressive cold lifted. The room was silent, save for the ragged breaths of the exhausted adults. The plastic skeleton on the sill was still. Lucia slept for 14 hours. When she woke on Halloween afternoon, she was herself again. Tired, confused, but Lucia. She had no memory of the previous weeks, only a vague recollection of bad dreams. Relief, warm and dizzying, flooded the Miller house. The media crew, having gotten their explosive finale, packed up and left. Father Andrew offered a quiet prayer of thanks and departed, his own faith forever altered. Leonard and Joel clung to each other, weeping, believing they had won. Only Harry felt no relief. The fear had not left him. It had simply changed its shape, becoming quieter, more profound. That night, Halloween night, the neighborhood erupted into its annual ritual. The streets were filled with tiny ghosts and superheroes, their laughter sharp and bright on the cold air. The smell of candy and wood smoke was everywhere. The Millers, trying to reclaim a shred of normalcy, handed out candy from a large bowl on their porch. Lucia, wrapped in a blanket, smiled weakly at the parade of costumes. Harry watched the trick-or-treaters. He saw a group of children in identical skeleton costumes, their movements oddly synchronized. He saw a tall, slender figure in a smooth, featureless beige mask, standing perfectly still beneath a street lamp, watching their house. He saw the scarecrow from the cornfield now standing at the edge of their property. Though he knew, it had been anchored to its post with a metal stake. The night wore on. The festivities died down. The last costumed child, a dinosaur, waddled away into the darkness. The family went inside, the lock on the front door clicking shut with a sound of finality. The house was quiet. They had survived. Later, as his parents slept the sleep of the emotionally ravaged, and Lucia rested peacefully in her drug-free slumber, Harry crept to his window. He looked out at the backyard, at the dark, whispering wall of the cornfield. The harvest moon, enormous and orange, hung low in the sky, its light casting long, distorted shadows. And there, in the center of the lawn, stood the jack-o'-lantern Lucia had carved with the spiraling hole in its forehead. The candle inside had long since guttered out. As Harry watched, a single perfect apple, red and unblemished, rolled slowly out of the dark mouth of the cornfield. It moved with a purpose that was not gravitational, tracing a gentle, curving path across the frost-kissed grass. It did not slow or waver. It rolled directly to the base of the silent, dark pumpkin. It came to a perfect, precise stop, nestled against the orange flesh, as if it had been placed there by an unseen hand. Inside the house, all was still. Upstairs in her room, Lucia slept, and on her nightstand, the antique porcelain doll mask she had worn while sleepwalking seemed, in the profound quiet of the post-midnight hour, to have the faintest, most impossible curve of a smile. The silence in the house was a held breath. Harry did not move from the window for a long time, his eyes fixed on the apple and the pumpkin. The pairing was wrong, an offense to the logic of the season. Apples were for bobbing, for caramel, for pies. They did not belong with the hollowed-out gourds of October. This was a different harvest altogether. He thought of waking his father, but the memory of Leonard S. exhausted, tear-streaked face stopped him. He thought of his mother, who had finally found sleep. He was alone with this new, quiet fact in the yard. A soft sound broke the stillness. Not a click, not a whisper, but a faint, wet crunch. Harry S.'s eyes darted back to the pumpkin. In the stark moonlight, something was different. The spiraling hole in its forehead, which had been empty and dark, now seemed filled. A pale, moist substance glistened within the convoluted opening, pulsing very slightly, like a brain exposed to the night air. He blinked, and it was gone, the hole once more a void. A trick of the light, he told himself, a shudder working its way down his spine. He forced himself to turn away from the window and crawl back into bed, pulling the covers over his head like a little child. He lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the house settle, every creak a footstep, every rustle of the wind a whispered sentence. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and fitful. He dreamed of the cornfield, not as a place of fear, but as a vast, silent audience. The stalks were rows of figures, watching him, their tassels like the plumes of helmets. In the center of the field, the scarecrow was gone. In its place stood the tall figure in the beige mask he had seen under the street lamp. It held a single, shining scythe that was not metal, but made of moonlight and frost. He woke with a start, the gray light of dawn seeping around the edges of his curtains. The house was still quiet. The dread of the night before clung to him, a damp, psychic residue. He went to his window and looked out. The apple was gone. The pumpkin sat alone on the lawn, inert and ordinary. A wave of foolish relief washed over him. It had been a hallucination, a final phantom of a traumatizing week. He went downstairs, the old wooden steps cool beneath his bare feet. He needed a glass of water, something to anchor him in the normal world. The kitchen was empty. The clock on the stove read 6:17 a.m. He filled a glass at the sink and turned, leaning against the counter. His eyes fell upon the kitchen table. In the center of the worn wooden surface, placed with neat intentionality, were 3 objects. The antique porcelain doll mask stared up at the ceiling with its blank, painted eyes. Next to it lay the small, battery-powered skeleton, silent and still. And beside them, perfectly centered on a clean white napkin, was the red apple, its skin unbroken, dewed with cold from the night air. From the doorway, a voice, soft and familiar, said, "You see it too, don't you?" Harry jumped, sloshing water onto his shirt. Lucia stood there, wrapped in her robe. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear, the warm brown back in them. Yet They held a new knowledge, a gravity that had not been there before the madness. "See what?" Harry whispered, his throat tight. She walked into the kitchen and picked up the apple. She didn't eat it. She just held it, weighing it in her palm. "That it wasn't an exorcism," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was a baptism. They didn't leave, Harry. They just changed the mask." She looked from the apple to the doll mask, her expression one of cold, resigned understanding. "And now it's my turn to wear it." She set the apple back down on the napkin with a soft, final tap. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent kitchen. Harry could only stare, his mind refusing to assemble the pieces she had just given him. The relief he had felt moments before was not just gone. It felt like a lie he had told himself. "What are you talking about?" he managed, his voice cracking. "You're better, the priest. The thing, it's gone." Lucia's smile was a small, sad thing. It didn't reach her eyes. "The loud one is gone. The one that shouts and breaks things. That was just the herald, the announcement." She picked up the doll mask, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold curve of its cheek. "The thing that is coming is quiet. It doesn't possess. It persuades. It offers a trade." "A trade for what?" "For the harvest." She looked toward the window, toward the cornfield. "It doesn't want souls, not like in the stories. It wants attention. It feeds on the act of being witnessed. On the fear, yes, but also the celebration, the dressing up, the carving. Every lit pumpkin is a little beacon for it. Every child pretending to be a monster is a tiny, perfect prayer." Harry thought of the frantic exorcism, the cameras, his own terrified face. He thought of the entire street, the whole town, decked out in its spooky finery, all of them unknowingly adding to the signal. "We invited it," he whispered, the truth dawning with a sickening clarity. "All of us." Lucia nodded, and it accepted. "The door is open now. It can't be closed." She placed the mask back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the apple and the skeleton. "It showed me, Harry, while I was asleep. It showed me the pattern. The corn, the pumpkins, the costumes. It's all part of the same cycle. A cycle that's been dormant, and now it's waking up again." The back door swung open then, making them both jump. Leonard stood there, his face haggard but hopeful, holding a bag of fresh bagels. "I thought we could all use a normal breakfast," he said, his voice too loud, too cheerful. He stopped, his gaze taking in the strange still life on the table, the mask, the toy, the apple. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. "What's all this?" "Lucia, you should be resting." Lucia looked from her father to Harry, and in that look was a silent, desperate plea for understanding. Then she turned to Leonard, and her face softened into the mask of a recovering daughter. "Just clearing out some of that weird Halloween stuff, Dad," she said, her voice light and convincingly frail. "It gives me the creeps now." Leonard's shoulders slumped with visible relief. "Of course, sweetheart, of course. Here, let me get rid of it." He moved toward the table, his hand outstretched for the doll mask. "Don't." The word was out of Harry's mouth before he could stop it, sharp and loud. Both Leonard and Lucia stared at him. I want it, Harry stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. For my room, a souvenir. He couldn't explain the conviction that had seized him, the certain knowledge that his father should not touch that mask. Leonard looked puzzled, then shrugged, a weary acceptance in his eyes. Okay, son, if you want it. He turned his attention to the bagels, bustling about the kitchen, trying to manufacture a morning that could not exist. Lucia met Harry's gaze over their father's head. Her eyes held no gratitude, only a deep and shared sorrow. She had told him the truth, and in doing so, she had passed him a burden. He was a witness now, too. He knew the shape of the thing that wore the world as a mask, and as he watched his sister carefully fold the napkin around the apple before placing it in the trash, he understood that the most terrifying hauntings were not the ones that went bump in the night, but the ones that learned to live quietly beside you, in the familiar skin of your own family, waiting for the next fall and the next harvest to begin again. He took the doll mask from the table. The porcelain was cold and strangely heavy in his hand. He didn't want it, not really, but the idea of it being anywhere near his father, or being thrown away where it could be found again, was unthinkable. He carried it upstairs and shoved it to the back of his closet, burying it under a pile of old shoes. It felt like hiding a bone. The day passed with a fragile, excruciating normalcy. Leonard made pancakes. Joel called work to say she would be out for another week. They watched old, comforting movies on the couch, a family bundled in blankets. But the silence between them was a new, living thing. Lucia participated. She smiled. She even laughed at a joke. But her eyes would occasionally drift to the window, to the cornfield, and a stillness would settle over her that had nothing to do with convalescence. Harry watched her more than he watched the movie. He saw the way her fingers would sometimes twitch, tracing a faint, spiral pattern on her knee. He saw the way she avoided looking directly at the fruit bowl on the counter, where Leonard had placed a new bunch of bananas and a few bright, waxy apples from the grocery store. That night, Harry lay in bed, listening. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. It was the quiet of a trap that has already been sprung. He heard the soft creak of a floorboard in the hall. He held his breath, expecting Lucia's sleepwalking tread. But the sound did not come again. Instead, a new sound began. A low, rhythmic scraping from outside. It was subtle, the sound of a tree branch rubbing against a gutter, or a loose shutter swinging in the wind. But there was no wind. He got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was higher now, smaller and colder. The backyard was a tableau in silver and black. The cornfield was a dark wall. The pumpkins still sat on the lawn. And near the edge of the property, where the grass met the first row of stalks, a figure was working. It was the scarecrow. Or what had been the scarecrow? Its post was gone. It stood on its own two burlap sack legs, its flannel shirt hanging loose. In its gloved hands, it held a long, wooden-handled scythe, and it was slowly, methodically, dragging the blade back and forth across a whetstone that lay at its feet. The motion was patient, practiced. The sound was the scraping Harry had heard. It was sharpening its tool. It stopped. Its head, a burlap sack stuffed with straw, slowly turned. It had no eyes, only stitched-on crosses, but Harry felt its gaze lock onto his window. It stood there, regarding him, the scythe poised in its hands. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it raised one arm and pointed the tip of the blade not at Harry, but at the house, at the window next to his own. Lucia's window. A soft light came on in her room. Harry turned from his window and rushed into the hall, his blood running cold. He didn't knock. He pushed her door open. Lucia was standing in the middle of her room, bathed in the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She was not sleepwalking. She was fully awake, her expression one of serene focus. She held a pair of fabric scissors in one hand. In the other, she held the old, paint-stained flannel shirt their father used for yard work. She was carefully, expertly, cutting the shirt into long, ragged strips. She looked up as Harry entered. Her eyes were not the eyes of his sister. They were the eyes of the doll mask, placid and empty of everything but purpose. "The harvester needs his bindings," she said, her voice a calm, flat echo. "The old ones are frayed." She held up a strip of the flannel. "It's almost time to bring in the rest." Downstairs, the front door creaked open on its own. A cold draft, smelling of damp earth and rotting pumpkins, slithered up the stairs and into the room. From the kitchen, they both heard the distinct, crisp sound of a single apple falling from the fruit bowl and rolling, with a purpose all its own. Across the floor, Harry stood frozen in the doorway, the cold from downstairs coiling around his ankles. Lucia continued her work, the snip, snip, snip of the scissors, a metronome in the dreadful stillness. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her entire world had narrowed to the task of cutting the cloth. He should run. He should scream for his parents. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his voice a shriveled thing in his throat. He was a witness. That was his role now. Lucia finished with the shirt. She let the ragged strips of flannel fall to the floor around her feet like a strange, soft nest. Then she laid the scissors neatly on her nightstand, next to the lamp. She walked toward him, her steps silent on the carpet. She didn't look at him as she passed, but paused in the doorway, her shoulder almost brushing his. "He's waiting," she said, her voice still that awful, placid monotone. "You can watch from the window. It's better if you watch." She moved down the hall and descended the stairs. Harry heard the front door swing shut. He forced his legs to move, stumbling back to his own room and to the window. Lucia was already in the backyard. She walked across the frosty grass, barefoot, toward the waiting scarecrow. It stood motionless now, the scythe held upright in one hand. As Lucia approached, it extended its other arm, the burlap glove crude and shapeless. She began to wind the strips of flannel around its wrist and up its arm, binding the sleeve to the limb beneath, her movements efficient and reverent. From the dark mouth of the cornfield, other figures emerged. They were not scarecrows. They were the children in the skeleton costumes he had seen earlier, their movements still perfectly synchronized. And the tall figure in the beige mask was with them, standing just at the edge of the moonlight, observing. Lucia finished her task and stepped back. The scarecrow turned its stitched face toward the cornfield and raised its newly bound arm. The scythe blade caught the moonlight, a sliver of cold silver in the orange glow. Then together, the scarecrow, the skeleton children, and the tall figure turned, not toward the field, but toward the house. Every blank face, every stitched cross eye, every smooth beige surface was aimed directly at Harry's window. They stood in a silent, gathered line, a congregation waiting for a sign. The back door of the house opened again. Leonard Miller walked out, his face slack with sleep, his eyes wide and unseeing. In one hand, he held the sharp kitchen knife he used for carving Sunday roasts. In the other, he held the red apple from the kitchen, the one Lucia had thrown away. He walked past his daughter as if she were just another feature of the landscape, his gaze fixed on the waiting figures. He stopped before the scarecrow. He offered it the apple. The scarecrow took it in its gloved hand. It brought the fruit to where its mouth would be, a slow, deliberate motion. It did not eat it. It simply held it there for a long, terrible moment, a dark communion. Then it dropped the apple into the grass. It looked from Leonard to the scythe in its own hand, then back to Leonard. An unspoken command passed between them. Leonard nodded, a slow, dreamy dip of his chin. He turned, not back to the house, but toward the street, the knife hanging loosely at his side. The silent congregation followed him, the scarecrow at the lead, its scythe now resting on its shoulder. The skeleton children fell into step behind it, and the tall figure brought up the rear, a silent shepherd. Lucia stood alone on the lawn for a moment, watching them go. Then she turned and looked up at Harry's window one last time. Her face was still serene, a perfect, empty mask. She turned and followed the others, disappearing into the shadows between the houses, leaving the backyard silent and empty save for the discarded apple and the dark, sightless pumpkin. Inside, the house was quieter than it had ever been. Harry stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass. He knew he was alone. He knew, with a certainty that filled the hollows of his bones, that his father was not going to a neighbor's house. He was going to light the next beacon, to begin the next phase of the harvest. And somewhere, in another house on another street, a new mask was waiting to be worn. The fog on the window pane began to thin, erased by the growing heat of his panic. He had to move. He had to do something. Call the police. Run after them. But his body was a statue, his mind a frantic animal trapped in a cage of bone. To go out there was to join them, to become part of the procession. He finally broke from the window, his legs weak and trembling. He stumbled into the hall toward his parents' bedroom. The door was ajar. The bed was empty, the covers thrown back where his father had risen. His mother was gone, too. He hadn't even heard her leave. A soft, electronic chirp came from the kitchen. He followed the sound, each step an effort. On the floor, near the overturned fruit bowl, lay the small, battery-powered skeleton. Its plastic bones were lit from within, a sickly orange glow pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. Like a heartbeat, he backed away, his breath catching in his throat. The house was not empty. It was occupied. It was watching. He ran to the landline phone on the wall. The old, beige receiver, feeling absurdly small and fragile in his hand. He pressed it to his ear. There was no dial tone, only a soft, rustling static that sounded exactly like dry cornstalks rubbing together in a breeze. He dropped the receiver. It clattered against the wall, swinging on its cord. The pulsing light from the toy skeleton seemed to grow brighter, throwing long, dancing shadows up the cabinets. He had to get out. He had to find someone, anyone, who wasn't part of this. He bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock and chain, his fingers numb and clumsy. He yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the porch. The street was not asleep. It was holding its breath. Every single house, as far as he could see in either direction, had a lit pumpkin on its porch. Their carved faces were no longer whimsical or scary. They were uniform. The same triangular eyes, the same jagged grins, all facing the street, all glowing with the same unwavering, malevolent orange light. It was a runway, a path, and at the far end of the street, where it curved out of sight, the glow was brighter. A concentration of that same orange light, pulsing gently, waiting. From inside the house behind him, the rustling static from the phone grew louder, spilling out the open door. It was joined by another sound, a low, rhythmic scraping. He turned his head slowly, already knowing what he would see. Through the living room window, he saw the scarecrow. It was standing in the center of the room, its scythe held upright. It was not moving. It was just standing there, a sentinel in his home, its stitched eyes facing the front door. Facing him. It had not left with the others. It had stayed behind. For him, the message was clear. There was no out. There was no escape. The harvest was not just outside, it was inside. It was in the walls, in the phone lines, in the very light of the pumpkins. He could run, but he would only be running down a path they had already lit for him. He took a step back, then another, descending the porch steps onto the walkway. He looked down the street, toward the pulsing orange glow. He looked back at his house, at the thing standing in his living room. He was a witness. That was all he was ever meant to be. So he turned, and with legs that felt like water, he began to walk. He walked down the center of the street, a lone figure between the rows of silent, watching houses, following the trail of light. He didn't know where it led. He only knew that his family was already there, and that his role was to see what happened next. The cool night air carried no sound, but the soft crunch of his own footsteps on the pavement. A tiny, insignificant noise against the vast and patient silence of the harvest. The orange glow at the end of the street did not clarify as he walked toward it. It remained a hazy, pulsing sphere, a miniature sun trapped behind the trees. The pumpkin faces watched his progress, their light seeming to intensify as he passed each house, as if drinking in his presence. He felt like a specimen on a slide, being observed under a lens of fire. He passed the Johnsons' house. Their decorative gravestones were still tilted in the lawn, but now dark, wet soil was mounded around their bases, as if something had recently pushed its way up from underneath. He passed the O'Malleys, where the rubber bats hanging from their porch roof now twitched and shuddered in the still air, their wings beating a frantic, silent tattoo against the night. He was getting closer. The light was not in the distance anymore. It was spilling from the town square, just around the next bend. The rustling static was here, too, not from phones, but from the very air, a psychic noise that vibrated in his teeth. He rounded the corner and stopped. The town square was transformed. It was not a gathering of people. It was a congregation of effigies. Dozens of scarecrows, all like the one from his field, stood in a wide, perfect circle. Their scythes were held at identical angles, their stitched faces turned inward. Between them, the skeleton children stood motionless, their glow a pale imitation of the central, terrible source. In the center of the square, where the old stone fountain usually stood, was the corn dolly. It was massive now, a towering figure woven not just from corn husks, but from the very stalks themselves, which seemed to be growing up from the pavement. Its surface seethed and rustled, and it bled light. The orange glow pulsed from within its crude, humanoid form, a slow, deep heartbeat that illuminated the entire scene. At the base of the dolly stood the tall figure in the beige mask, and before it, on their knees, were the people. His father, Leonard, was there, his head bowed. His mother, Joel, was beside him, her hand resting on his back. Lucia stood just behind them, her face upturned to the dolly, her expression one of rapt devotion. The entire town was there, all on their knees, all facing the central light. They were not prisoners. They were supplicants. The beige-masked figure raised its hands. The rustling ceased. The only sound was the low, throbbing hum of the light. Then a single, clear voice cut through the silence. It was Lucia's. "The soil is prepared," she chanted, her voice ringing with an authority that was not her own. "The seeds are sown. The witness has arrived. Every head, every stitched face, every blank mask, turned in unison to look at Harry. The weight of their collective gaze was a physical pressure, pushing him forward into the circle. The beige figure gestured, a slow, beckoning motion. Harry S. feet moved without his consent. He walked through a gap in the ring of scarecrows, his shoes scuffing on the cobblestones. He was led to a spot directly before the kneeling forms of his parents. He could see the side of his father's face, the track of a single tear cutting through the grime on his cheek. It was not a tear of fear, but of awe. The beige figure looked down at him. Up close, the mask was not plastic or ceramic. It looked like skin, stretched taut and featureless. It leaned close, and Harry could feel a dry, heatless warmth radiating from it. "It is not a monster," it whispered, its voice the sound of leaves skittering across pavement. "It is a prayer, and you are the final word." It placed its hands on his shoulders and turned him to face the corn dolly. The light swelled, filling his vision, burning away all thought, all resistance. He felt a vast, ancient attention focus on him. He saw the cycle, not as a story, but as a truth. The planting, the growth, the harvest, the decay that feeds new growth. An endless, hungry wheel. And he saw his place in it, not as a victim, but as a part of the whole. A necessary part. He did not feel afraid anymore. He felt a profound, settling peace. He understood now. His fear, his resistance, had been the last untilled soil. His acceptance was the final seed. He looked at Lucia. She smiled at him, a real, genuine smile, and gave a slight, encouraging nod. Harry turned back to the glowing dolly. He slowly, deliberately, knelt down beside his parents on the cold stone. He bowed his head. Above him, the dolly pulsed once, a wave of light so bright it bleached the color from the world. And from the circle of scarecrows, a dozen scythes rose into the air, their blades catching the impossible light, ready to begin the reaping. The light did not fade. It intensified, pressing down on his bowed head like a physical weight, a crown of pure energy. The humming filled his skull, vibrating the bones of his jaw, until it was no longer a sound, but a thought. A single, unified thought that was not his own, yet was now his entirely. The soil is rich, the crop is ripe. He did not need to look up to know what was happening. He felt it. He felt the scarecrows step forward in perfect unison, their burlap feet whispering against the cobblestones. He felt the shift in the air as the scythes were raised higher, the metal singing a silent, eager song. He expected a slash, a cut, an end. It was not an end. The first touch was not of a blade, but of a hand. His father's hand resting on his shoulder, the grip firm and warm, and full of a love so vast it felt like sorrow. Then his mother's hand found his other shoulder. Then Lucia's small, cool hand rested on the top of his head. A connection, a circuit. The light from the corn dolly poured into him. It was not burning. It was blooming. It flowed through the touch of his family, filling the hollows of his fear with a golden, thrumming certainty. He saw the roots of the town, not in the soil, but in the silence between the heartbeats of its people. He saw the years of quiet desperation, the buried hopes, the small, unspoken hatreds, all laid out like fertilizer. The harvest was not of bodies, but of silence. It was the reaping of all the things never said, the feelings never shared, the truths never acknowledged. The town was not being consumed. It was being heard. A profound understanding settled over him. The scarecrows were not murderers. They were reapers of silence. The The scythes did not cut flesh. They severed the binds of quiet suffering. The light was not destroying them. It was translating them into something pure, something part of the whole. He finally looked up. The scythes were falling, but they passed through the kneeling people as if through smoke. And as they passed, something was released. From his father, a gray, shimmering mist of workplace worries and quiet disappointments. From his mother, a pale, twisting vapor of loneliness. From Lucia, a faint, sparkling dust of ignored thoughts. From every person in the square, their hidden burdens were gently, cleanly cut loose. The corn Dolly inhaled. The released silences streamed toward it, a river of muted color and soundless noise, and were drawn into the pulsing, woven form. The Dolly grew brighter, more solid, more real. The orange light softened, warming to a deep, honeyed gold. The beige-masked figure watched, its head tilted, its purpose fulfilled. As Harry watched, the mask seemed to soften, to flow, the featureless surface gaining the gentle lines of a familiar face. For a moment, it was old Mr. Hendricks, the previous owner of their farm, who had died the spring before. Then it was no one at all, just a wisp of memory dissolving into the growing light. The scarecrows lowered their scythes. Their stiff, burlap postures relaxed. One by one, they crumbled, not into rot, but into rich, dark soil that smelled of rain and growth, pooling around their own feet before sinking into the cobblestones. The skeleton children S lights flickered and went out, their plastic shells collapsing into harmless piles. The Dolly was the only thing left shining, a serene, silent monolith of woven gold. Then, with a sound like a vast, contented sigh, it too began to dissolve. It didn't fall. It unfolded. It spread outwards in a wave of warm, living light that washed over the square, over the people, over Harry. The light soaked into everything, into the stones, into the trees, into their skin. It did not vanish. It settled. The world looked the same, but it was fundamentally different. The air was clearer. The colors were deeper. The silence was no longer heavy, but peaceful. Harry looked at his family. His father was looking back at him, his eyes clear, the weight of years gone from his face. He smiled, a real, easy smile Harry hadn't seen since he was a small child. His mother was weeping, but they were tears of release, her body shaking with a joy so profound it had to overflow. Lucia simply took his hand, her grip strong, her eyes his sister's again, but wiser, older. All around them, the people of the town were rising, not with confusion, but with a quiet, dazed wonder. They looked at each other, really looked, as if for the first time. A man helped his neighbor to her feet. A woman laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened delight that echoed in the newfound stillness. The harvest was over. The silence had been gathered, and in its place, something new had been planted. Harry stood with his family in the quiet town square under the first hints of the coming dawn, and knew that for the first time in his life, or in any of their lives, they were truly listening. The walk home was different. The street was the same. The houses were the same. But the pumpkins on the porches were just pumpkins again, their candles guttering out in the pale pre-dawn light. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and nothing else. No rustling static, no psychic weight, just the world as it was. No one spoke. They didn't need to. His father walked with an arm around his mother, who leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. Lucia held Harry's hand, her small fingers intertwined with his. They were a unit, whole and connected in a way they had never been before. When they reached their house, the front door was still open, swinging gently in the morning breeze. The scarecrow was gone. The living room was just a living room, a little messy, but ordinary. The toy skeleton lay in the kitchen, dark and inert. The phone, when Harry picked up the dangling receiver, had a clear, bright dial tone. His father walked to the kitchen sink and poured a glass of water. He drank it slowly, then looked out the window at the backyard, at the field where it had all begun. "It needed us," he said, his voice quiet but steady. All that quiet, it was starving. His mother nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's gone now." But Harry knew it wasn't gone. It was satisfied. It had been fed, and in return, it had given them back to themselves. He went to his room and looked out the window. The rising sun was painting the horizon in streaks of pink and orange. It looked like a normal morning. It felt like the first morning. Later, when the sun was fully up, he saw his father walk out into the cornfield. He didn't have a scythe. He just walked between the rows, his hand brushing the tops of the drying stalks. He wasn't harvesting. He was checking the soil, planning for the next planting. A quiet, simple man doing a quiet, simple job. The cycle was not broken. It was just different now. It was no longer hungry. Harry turned from the window. The house was quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of everything they no longer had to say. The rest of the day was spent in a kind of gentle, mutual cleanup. They righted the overturned fruit bowl. They folded the blankets on the couch. They made a simple lunch and ate it at the kitchen table. The clink of forks against plates the only sound, but it was a comfortable sound. The frantic energy of the previous day's Halloween preparations felt like a memory from someone else's life. A frantic pantomime they had all been acting out without knowing the reason. In the afternoon, Lucia came and found Harry sitting on the back steps. She sat down beside him, her knees pulled up to her chin. For a long time, they just watched the corn sway in the breeze. "It showed me things," she said, her voice small. "When it took me, it wasn't scary. It was just true. It showed me Mom feeling invisible when Dad comes home from work. It showed me you feeling like you don't belong here. It showed me Dad's fear that the farm is failing." She turned her head to look at him. "It showed me my own thoughts, the mean ones I have about everyone, and it didn't judge them. It just collected them." Harry nodded. He understood. The thing in the square had been a mirror, reflecting back all the unspoken truths until they were too loud to ignore. "It is quieter now," Lucia said. "Inside my head, it is nice." That night, as Harry lay in bed, the darkness felt different. It was not a void to be filled with dread, but a soft blanket. He could hear the house settling, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant call of an owl. They were just sounds. They held no hidden meaning. He realized the fear he had lived with for years, the constant, low-grade anxiety that he attributed to being a teenager, had been a tiny, personal harvest all its own. Now, it was gone. The next morning, his father announced they were going to town for groceries. The idea felt monumental. Getting in the car, driving down that street, seeing the people. But it was also necessary. The street was ordinary. Children's bicycles lay in lawns. A neighbor waved as they drove past, and his father waved back, a genuine, easy gesture. The town square was just a town square. The stone fountain was back, water bubbling peacefully. There were no traces of soil, no lingering golden light. But something was different. People met each other's eyes. Conversations at the crosswalk were slower, more deliberate. The woman at the grocery store checkout smiled at Harry, a real smile that reached her eyes, and asked him how his family was doing. For the first time, he felt she actually wanted to know. They drove home as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in familiar colors. As they pulled into the driveway, Harry saw it. A single, perfect pumpkin sitting on their porch step. It was uncarved. Its skin was a deep, vibrant orange, and it seemed to glow with the last of the day's light. No one had put it there. His father turned off the car, and they all sat for a moment, looking at it. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder, a seed for the future. His father finally broke the silence. "It's a good one," he said, his voice soft. "We'll save it for the seeds." Harry knew then that the harvest was not an annual event. It was a part of them now, and they would tend to it, season after season, in the quiet of their own hearts, making sure the silence never grew hungry again. Story 2. The first sound was not a sound at all, but a silence so profound it had a texture, a density, like wool packed into the ears. And into that silence, a whisper began to thread itself. It was the whisper of a single dried leaf, scraping its brittle body back and forth, across the slate step outside the old Blackwood house. It was a metronome counting down the seconds until Halloween, a tiny, dry tongue speaking only of decay. I had arrived in the village of Harvest End on October 28th. The air was cold in a way that seeps deep, carrying the wet, sweet-sour smell of rotting apples and wood smoke. My name is Juan, and I am a solicitor. I was sent by my firm in the city to settle the affairs of Mr. Alastair Cameron, a recluse who had died with no known heirs and a considerable, if dusty, fortune tied up in this ancestral home. It was a simple task, they said. Inventory, assessment, a quick sale, a few days' work at most. But Harvest End was not a simple place. It lay in a hollow between ancient, sleeping hills. and the trees that crowded its edges were already skeletal, their black branches clawing at a sky the color of a day-old bruise. Every porch, it seemed, hosted a grinning, leering jack-o'-lantern. Their candle flames danced like captive spirits, and their carved eyes, triangles and crescents, seemed to follow my rental car as I crept down the main street. The orange light they cast was sickly, a false warmth that made the shadows behind them all the deeper. On one porch, a plastic skeleton hung from a noose, twisting slowly in the wind, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw the gleam of real bone beneath the cheap paint. I took a room at the only inn, the Restful Traveler, a name that proved to be a cruel joke. The proprietor, a man with a face like a closed fist and eyes that held no welcome, merely grunted and slid a key across the polished wood. "The camera in place," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Best be done and gone before the 31st. He did not explain, and I, city-bred and rational, dismissed it as small-town superstition. The next morning, the 29th, I went to the house. It was a Gothic monstrosity of weathered gray stone, crouching at the end of a long, leaf-choked driveway. 2 enormous oak trees flanked the path, their branches intertwined like bony fingers in prayer. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, a faint, coppery tang like old blood. The front door was unlocked, as the village constable had promised. It opened with a groan that was less a protest of hinges and more a vocalization of the house itself. Inside, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart and that same dry, scraping leaf from the step. Dust motes danced in the slants of pale light that cut through the grime on the windows. The furniture was shrouded in white sheets, giving the rooms the appearance of a gathering of ghosts. My footsteps on the parquet floor echoed as if in a cathedral. My work was methodical, monotonous. I opened drawers filled with yellowed linen. I examined ledgers filled with the spidery script of a bygone era. I catalogued tarnished silver and porcelain figurines with vacant, painted eyes. It was ritualistic, this sorting of a dead man's life, and the house seemed to watch me, patient and hungry. It was in the library that I found her. Not in person, of course, but in a portrait above the cold fireplace. She was young, perhaps 18, with hair the color of autumn oak leaves and eyes of a startling, clear gray. She wore a simple white dress, and she held a single, wilted black-eyed Susan. There was no smile on her face, only a profound and unsettling sadness, a resignation that seemed to reach out of the canvas and clutch at my throat. Her name, I would later learn from a diary I found tucked behind a loose brick in the hearth, was Alara. Alastair Cameron's diary was not the record of a madman, but of a man consumed by a grief so profound it had curdled into something else, something dark and fearful. He wrote of Alara, his ward, who had a sight. She could see the other folk, the things that walked in the twilight, the presences that gathered at the edges of the fields, especially as the veil thinned in October. He wrote of his love for her, a love that was possessive, desperate. And he wrote of Halloween night 5 years ago. There had been a party in the village, a bonfire, games. Alara had been frightened, had begged to stay home. He had insisted. He wanted to show her off, this strange, beautiful girl he kept hidden away. The diary entry for that night was a single, trembling sentence. They took her in the corn maze. She went in, and she never came out. Her body was found the next morning at the edge of the woods. Not a mark on her, her white dress pristine, her eyes wide open and filled with a terror that had frozen on her face. The official verdict was exposure, a tragic accident. But Cameron knew. The village knew. They had given her to the old gods of this place, to the things that hunger on Samhain. They had used the tradition of the maze, the playful fear, as a conduit for something ancient and terrible. It was a sacrifice, a tithe to ensure a good harvest, to keep the darkness from their own doors. That night, back in my room at the inn, I could not sleep. The wind had picked up, moaning under the eaves, and it carried with it the distant, laughing shrieks of teenagers perhaps, or something else. I lay in the narrow bed, the coarse sheets rough against my skin, and I felt the weight of the village's secret. I was an outsider, a meddler, stirring up mud they had let settle for half a decade. On the 30th, the atmosphere in Harvest's End had shifted. The festive decorations now seemed like grim trophies. The jack-o'-lantern's grins were no longer playful, but savage. The plastic skeletons seemed to rattle with a knowing mirth. The villagers I passed on the street would not meet my eyes. Their gazes slid away, fixing on the ground, on the orange and black crepe paper fluttering in the wind. When I went to the general store for supplies, the conversation died the moment I entered. The only sound was the rustle of candy corn in a large glass jar. I returned to the Cameron house, drawn by a morbid compulsion. The air inside was colder now, and the silence felt watchful. As I sorted through a box of old photographs, I heard it. A soft, shuffling step in the hall outside the library. The scent of wilted flowers, of damp earth, filled my nostrils. I froze, my hand hovering over a picture of a young Alistair and a smiling Alara. The doorknob began to turn slowly, with a rusty squeal that set my teeth on edge. The door swung open. There was nothing there. Nothing but the empty, dark hall. But on the floor, just across the threshold, lay a single, fresh black-eyed Susan, its petals bruised and dark. That was when the fear truly took root in me, a cold seed unfurling in my gut. It was no longer just a sad story in a diary. She was here. Alara was here, and her grief had festered for 5 long years in the soil of this terrible place, fed by the guilt of a man and the complicity of a village. And Halloween was tomorrow. The day of the 31st dawned gray and still. An unnatural quiet had fallen over Harvest's End, a held breath. The sky was the color of lead, and a low, thick fog began to coil through the streets in the afternoon, mingling with the fake mist from fog machines, until the world was a monochrome of gray and the occasional garish orange of a pumpkin. By 4 o'clock, it was as dark as midnight, The wind had died completely, leaving the air heavy, humid, and cold. I knew I should have left, gotten in my car and driven, and never looked back. But some part of me, the solicitor, needed to finish the job. And another, deeper part, the part that had seen the sadness in her portrait and read the terror in the diary, felt a pull, a dreadful fascination. I had to be at the house. I had to see. I stood in the library as the last of the light failed. I had not brought a candle, and the only illumination came from the village below. A faint, festive glow filtered through the fog and the grimy windows. I could hear the first of the trick-or-treaters, their voices high and sharp, singing out trick or treat. Their laughter sounded brittle, like glass breaking. Then the doorbell rang. It was an old, mechanical chime, a sound I had not heard before. It echoed through the empty house, stark and demanding. My heart hammered against my ribs. No one would come here, not on this night. It rang again, insistent. I walked to the front door, my legs feeling numb and foreign. I grasped the cold, brass knob and pulled it open. The porch was empty, but on the welcome mat sat a small wicker basket. It was filled with apples, their skins a deep, bloody red, and twisted sticks of licorice that looked like strips of darkness made solid. And nestled among them were more black-eyed Susans, fresh and vibrant, their dark centers like pools of void. I looked up, out into the yard. The fog had thickened, but for a moment it parted, and I saw her. She stood at the edge of the driveway, where the light from the nearest jack-o'-lantern could not reach. She wore the white dress from the portrait, though it was now stained with earth at the hem. Her hair was wild, tangled with leaves and twigs, and her face was not the sad, resigned face from the painting. It was a mask of pure, primordial rage. Her eyes were no longer gray, but black, bottomless pits. She did not look at me. She was looking past me, through me, at the village below, at the people who had given her to the dark. Then she was gone. The fog swallowed the space where she had been. A scream tore through the night from the village square. It was not a child's playful shriek. It was a sound of absolute, gut-wrenching terror, cut short. I ran. I do not know why. I ran down the driveway, my feet slipping on the wet leaves, my breath tearing from my lungs in ragged gasps. I ran towards the sound, towards the festive lights that now seemed to flicker and die one by one. The main street was a scene from a nightmare. The fog was alive, it seemed, twisting into shapes that were almost human. The grinning pumpkins now appeared to be screaming. Children in costumes stood frozen, their parents clutching them, their faces pale with a fear that was no longer part of the game. In the center of the square, near the unlit bonfire pile, a man was on his knees. It was the innkeeper. He was clutching his throat, his eyes bulging, making a wet, gurgling sound. Vines, thin and dark, were wrapped around his neck, growing up from the ground itself, pulling him down. They were studded with small, black-eyed Susans. Another scream from a house nearby. I saw a woman silhouetted in a window, her hands clawing at the glass as something unseen dragged her back into the darkness. The vengeance of Alara was not a specter rattling chains. It was the earth itself turning against them. It was the roots and the vines and the creeping things that they had fed with her blood. The harvest they had sown 5 years ago was being reaped, and it was a harvest of terror. I stumbled back, away from the chaos, my mind screaming for the safety of the Cameron house, the only place I knew. I burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind me and leaning against it, my chest heaving. The house was dark, but it was not silent. From the library came a soft, rhythmic sound, a scraping. I pushed myself away from the door and walked, compelled, towards the sound. The library door was ajar. A single candle now burned on the mantelpiece, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. And in the center of the room, in my chair, sat a figure. It was Alistair Cameron, or what was left of him. His body was desiccated, a leathery puppet propped up in the seat. But his head was tilted back, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. And from his open mouth, a black-eyed Susan grew, its roots spilling out over his lips, its vibrant yellow petals a hideous mockery of life. And then I saw her, reflected in the dark glass of the window. She was standing behind me. I could feel the cold radiating from her, could smell the rich, wet soil of the grave. I did not dare turn around. Her reflection was close, her black eyes fixed on mine. She brought a pale, slender finger to her lips. The whisper was not in my ears, but in my mind, a thought that was not my own, a rustle of dead leaves and crumbling earth. You see, it said, you see what they did. You are not one of them, but you are here. You are a witness. I felt a pressure on my forehead, a coldness that spread through my skull like ice. My vision began to swim, the room tilting, the shadows swallowing the candlelight. The last thing I saw was the portrait of Alara, and for a moment, her expression was no longer one of rage or sadness, but of a terrible, infinite pity. The cold is not so bad now. It is just a memory of cold, like the memory of a story told long ago. The scraping leaf is a lullaby, a gentle rhythm that rocks me. I am sitting in a field of black-eyed Susans under an orange harvest moon that never sets. The sky is always that deep, twilight blue of a perfect October evening, just before the dark winds. There is no village. There is no house. There is only the field and the moon and the whispering of the flowers. They tell me stories. They tell me about a girl named Alara and a man named Cameron and a solicitor who came from a city far away. It is a sad story, but it feels distant, like something that happened to someone else in a book I read once by a flickering jack-o'-lantern S-light on a Halloween that never really ended. The wind carries the faint, sweet smell of candy and burning leaves, and I am waiting. I am always waiting for the next trick-or-treater to come down the path, so I can fill their basket with blood-red apples and flowers that bloom from the mouths of the dead. The waiting is a quiet thing. It has no edges, no beginning or end. It simply is, like the hum of the earth beneath this field of perpetual twilight. Sometimes, a path forms between the flowers, a ribbon of dark soil leading from the edge of my perception to the place where I sit. That is when I know a visitor is coming. They are always children. Their faces are pale smudges in the gloom, their costumes shimmering with borrowed memory. A tiny ghost, its sheet glowing faintly. A small witch with a pointed hat. A superhero, his cape a splash of primary color against the endless blue and orange. They do not speak. They simply hold out their baskets, their eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting a sky that holds no stars. I do not move. I do not need to. The apples, glossy and perfect, roll from the roots at my feet and into their waiting containers. The black-eyed Susans twist from the soil, their stems weaving themselves into handles, their dark centers watching the children as they turn and walk back down the path, disappearing into the mist that hangs at the field's edge. I do not know what happens to them after they leave. The stories the flowers whisper do not tell me that. They only tell me of the past, of the guilt that built this place. They speak of the innkeeper, whose throat is now forever entwined with thorny vines. They murmur of the woman who was pulled into the shadows of her own home, her screams now just a texture in the wind. They have become part of the story, too. Their fear is a nutrient in the soil. I am the gatekeeper of this quiet harvest. I am the curator of this endless Halloween. My own memories are like pages in a book that someone else is reading aloud to me. The city, the firm, the rental car. They are faded, water-damaged illustrations. They have no weight. The only thing that is real is the cool, damp earth beneath me and the silent procession of children. But something is changing. The last child who came was different. She was a little girl in a princess costume, a tinfoil crown perched on her curly hair. She did not hold out her basket right away. She looked at me, her head tilted. Her eyes were not empty. They were a deep, liquid brown, and they were full of a question. For the first time in an eternity, a feeling stirred in the cold stillness of my being. It was not pity. It was not fear. It was a crack, a fissure in the perfect, frozen lake of my existence. The flowers around me rustled, a sound of dry disapproval. The whispering in my mind grew louder, a chorus of dead leaves insisting on the story, on the ritual, on the vengeance. But the little princess just stood there, waiting. She was not afraid of me. She was curious. Slowly, against the pressure of 1,000 whispering wills, my hand lifted. It felt heavy, made of stone and old wood. I reached not for an apple or a flower, but towards her. My fingers, pale and streaked with dirt, came to a stop just short of her face. She smiled, a small, fleeting thing. Then she held out her basket. I filled it with the usual offerings, and she turned and skipped away, her tinfoil crown glinting once before she was swallowed by the mist. The field is restless now. The orange moon seems to pulse with a slow, sullen rhythm. The whispers are not just stories anymore. are arguments. They are fears. They say an untainted one should not have come here. They say the balance is threatened. A new path is forming. This one is not dark soil. It is paved with cobblestones I recognize from the main street of Harvest S End. And walking down it, not with the hesitant steps of a child, but with a determined, terrible stride, is the innkeeper. The vines are still around his neck, blooming with those hideous flowers, but his eyes are his own, and they are fixed on me. They burn with a hatred that is hotter than any candle flame. He should not be here. He is part of the story, not a visitor to it. He stops at the edge of the field where the flowers meet the cobblestones. He points a thick, accusing finger at me. You, he snarls, and his voice is the sound of roots tearing through stone. You let her in. You are breaking the tail. The black-eyed Susans around me writhe, their stems tightening like fists. The whispering becomes a shriek in my mind, demanding I act, demanding I pull him into the soil, to make him silent again. But I remember the little girl's smile. I remember the question in her eyes, and for the first time since the cold took me, I remember my name. Juan. The name is a key. It turns in the lock of my stillness. I look at the innkeeper, at his rage, which is just another part of Alara's grief. I look at the endless field, which is her prison as much as it is mine. I stand up. The earth groans in protest. The moon dims. I am not supposed to move. I am the witness, the still point. But I am moving. I take a step towards the innkeeper, and the cobblestones feel alien and hard under my bare feet. He takes a step back, his hatred mingled with confusion. This is not the story. This is not what happened, but it is what is happening now. The innkeeper's form began to waver, the cobblestones beneath his feet cracking as thin, dark roots pushed up through the mortar. He was being pulled back, reclaimed by the narrative of vengeance that had written his fate. His mouth opened, not to scream, but to release a cloud of black petals that scattered on a wind I could not feel. I took another step, and then another, leaving the soft, suffocating soil of the field, and walking onto the hard, cold reality of the cobblestone path. With each step, the perpetual twilight of the field receded, the orange moon shrinking to a dim lantern hung far behind me. The whispering of the flowers faded to a distant, angry hiss. The path led me not to the village, but to the Cameron house. It stood as I remembered it, a dark silhouette against a sky that was now the deep, true black of a real Halloween night. No festive glow came from the village below. There was only silence. The front door was open. I walked inside. The air was frigid and still. In the library, the candle on the mantel was gone. Alistair Cameron's body was gone. The only thing that remained was the portrait of Alara. Her face was different once more. The rage was gone. The pity was gone. Now, there was only a profound and weary attention. She was watching me, waiting to see what I would write next. I am not one of them, I had thought. I am a witness, But a witness is not a stone. A witness is a person, and a person can choose to speak. I walked to the desk, to the open diary, where Alastair's trembling script ended. I found a pen in the drawer, its nib dry and rusty. I did not need ink. I pressed the tip to a fresh page, and the words formed in a pale, silvery trail, as if written with frost. "It does not have to be this story," I wrote. "The harvest does not have to be terror." The house seemed to hold its breath. The portrait's eyes followed my hand. "A sacrifice was made," I continued, the cold from the pen seeping into my fingers. "But a sacrifice can be an end, or it can be a seed. You can let this grief be the last thing you grow." I felt her then, not as a reflection or a whisper, but as a presence in the room, standing just behind my shoulder. The scent of damp earth and wilted flowers was overwhelming. A terrible sadness filled the space, a sadness so vast it could drown worlds. In the portrait, a single silver tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not water. It was the first drop of a thaw. Outside, the wind began to blow, a real wind, scouring the fog and clearing the sky. The false, perpetual Halloween was breaking. The path behind me was gone. The field of black-eyed Susans was receding into a memory. I am still here in the Cameron house. The dawn is still far away, but the weight in the air is different. It is no longer a held breath of fear, but the quiet, aching potential of a story that is, for the first time in 5 years, no longer certain of its ending. I am the witness, and I have spoken. And now, we wait for the true sun to rise. The first true sound of the new day was not a bird or the wind, but the distant, hesitant crow of a rooster from a farm on the outskirts of the village. The sound was thin, strained, as if the bird itself was unsure it was allowed to break the silence. I stood at the library window, my hand resting on the cold glass. The leaden gray of the sky was softening at the edges, bleeding into a pale, watery blue. Down in the village, there were no morning sounds of commerce, no clatter of trash cans or rumble of delivery trucks. Only a deep, stunned quiet. I could see figures moving slowly in the streets, small and hunched against the dawn. They moved like people after a storm, assessing the damage. I saw a man stop in the middle of the road and simply stare at his hands, as if he had never seen them before. I left the library and walked through the silent house. It felt different. The oppressive weight of watched history had lifted. It was just an old house now, empty and cold, its secrets spent. I pulled open the heavy front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was clean and sharp, scrubbed free of the cloying fog and the fake scent of candy. The smell was of wet leaves and damp earth, the honest smell of November. The garish orange of the pumpkins looked faded and foolish in the gray light. Some were smashed, their grins shattered. Others seemed to have withered overnight, collapsing in on themselves like rotten fruit. I walked down the driveway and into the village. The evidence of the night was everywhere, but it was subtle woven into the fabric of the ordinary. Vines, now brittle and brown, clung to the sides of houses and lampposts, their grip looking desperate and final. A single, crushed black-eyed Susan lay in a gutter, its yellow petals trampled into the mud. People avoided my eyes as I passed. Their faces were hollow, with a shock too deep for words. They did not see me as a stranger anymore. They saw me as part of the haunting, a fragment of the long night they had just endured. I saw the little girl. She was sitting on the steps of the inn, still wearing her tinfoil crown, now bent and tarnished. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her mother sat beside her, an arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her face a mask of exhausted relief. The little girl looked up as I passed. Her deep brown eyes met mine, and there was no fear in them, only a quiet, knowing look. She had been to the field. She remembered. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I knew then that I would not be staying. My job was finished, not as a solicitor, but as a witness who had chosen to speak. There was no bill to present, no deed to sign. The account had been settled in a currency of terror, and perhaps a sliver of grace. I got into my car. The engine turned over with a mundane, comforting roar. As I drove slowly down the main street and out of Harvest's End, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The village receded, a cluster of houses nestled in the valley, wrapped in its grief and its hard-won silence. The Cameron house was a dark speck on the hill, its windows blank. I thought of the portrait inside, of the silver tear on her cheek. The story was not over. Stories never are. But the chapter of vengeance, I believed, had finally closed. The harvest was ended. What they would plant in its place was a question for them alone. I drove towards the rising sun, leaving the long Halloween behind, carrying only the memory of a field of flowers and the weight of a story that had, for a moment, been changed. The highway was a gray ribbon leading back to a world of concrete and noise. The silence in the car was my own now, a heavy, personal thing. My phone, dead since I arrived, suddenly chimed to life as I reached the outskirts of the city, buzzing with a backlog of messages from the firm. They were questions about the Cameron account, about deadlines and billable hours. The words seemed to be in a foreign language, their concerns as insubstantial as smoke. I didn't go to the office. I went to my apartment. It was exactly as I had left it, sterile and anonymous. I stood in the shower for a long time, letting the hot water scald my skin, but a core of deep, cellular cold remained. It was the chill of that other earth, the soil of the field under the orange moon. It had taken root in me. I called in sick for a week. My boss's voice was tight with suspicion, but didn't he care? The priorities of that life had been utterly erased. I spent my days sitting by the window, watching the city move, feeling like a ghost, haunting my own existence. The memory of the little princess's smile was the only warm thing I carried. A week later, a small, plain package arrived in the mail. There was no return address, only a postmark from a town neighboring Harvest's End. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single, pressed black-eyed Susan. It was perfectly preserved, its dark center like a pupil watching me. There was no note. I framed it. I hung it on my wall, a small, dark eye looking out over my sterile living room. It was not a threat. It was a reminder, a receipt. I quit my job. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. Perhaps I had. But sanity, I had learned, is a narrow definition for a world that is far wider and stranger than most are willing to see. I found a new apartment, one with a small, south-facing balcony. I bought bags of potting soil and terracotta pots. I planted seeds I ordered from a specialty catalog, seeds for flowers that thrive in shadow and poor soil. My neighbors on the balcony below complain about the dirt that sometimes drifts down onto their patio furniture. Tonight is Halloween. The city is loud with a cheap, commercial kind of fright. Children in store-bought costumes run through the streets below, their laughter sharp and fleeting. I sit on my balcony in the dark, surrounded by my sleeping plants. The air is thick with the city's smells of exhaust and fried food. If I close my eyes and breathe in deeply, I can just catch it. Beneath it all, the faint, sweet decay of burning leaves, the whisper of a story that is not yet finished. And on the wind, if I listen very closely, the soft, dry rustle of petals against my door. I do not get up to answer. I know no one is there. The sound is not a knock, but a settling, a final piece of soil falling into place. The flowers on my balcony have begun to bloom. They are not the black-eyed Susans of that other field. These are darker, with velvety petals the color of a deep bruise, and their centers are not black, but a shimmering liquid silver, like the tear on a painted cheek. They do not whisper of the past. They are quiet. They are waiting. A new story is being planted. It is not one of vengeance, but of watchfulness. I am no longer a witness to someone else's tale. I am the gardener of this quiet, urban plot. The cold inside me is not a curse anymore. It is a tool, a connection to the thin places where other fields might grow, where other lost things might wander. A child dressed as a dragon stumbles on the sidewalk below, dropping a plastic pumpkin spilling with candy. For a moment, the space around him wavers. The street lamp's light seems to dim, and a path of fallen leaves, red and gold and impossibly bright, appears for just a second at his feet, leading away from the noise and into the dark alley between two buildings. He does not see it. He is too busy gathering his candy. His parent scoops him up, and the moment is gone. But I saw it. The flowers on my balcony rustle, a soft, approving sound. They are not feeding on fear. They are nourished by potential, by the stories that are almost told, the choices that are almost made. I am still Juan. I am a man who lives in an apartment and grows strange flowers. But I am also the gatekeeper of a different kind of harvest. The children who come to my door tonight will receive chocolate and brightly wrapped sweets. They will never know that the quiet man in the ground floor apartment holds the silence of another world in his hands. They will never see the silver-eyed flowers watching them from the shadows of my balcony. But sometimes a child will look up. Their eyes will meet mine through the peephole. And in that brief, unspoken exchange, a question will hang in the air, a path not yet taken. I will nod just once. A tiny, almost invisible gesture, an acknowledgement. Then I will close the door and listen to the sound of their footsteps fading away, back into the safety of their own story. And I will turn back to my flowers, to the quiet hum of the earth beneath this city of stone, and continue my waiting. It is a different kind of waiting now. It is patient. It is full of a dark and fertile peace. The long Halloween is over, but the watchful autumn never ends. The city winter was harsh, a gritty, salt-stained season that killed the grass in the parks and turned the streets to slush. My flowers, however, did not die. They did not even wilt. The bruise-colored petals absorbed the weak sunlight, and the silver centers seemed to glow brighter on the shortest days, holding their own light against the gray. The cold that lived in my bones was an advantage now. I felt no discomfort, only a steady, thrumming connection to the dormant life beneath the frozen pavement. I took a job as a night watchman at a museum of natural history. It suited me. The vast, silent halls, filled with the bones of dead things, were a comfort. I would walk my rounds past the towering skeletons of dinosaurs and the glass cases of extinct birds and feel a kinship with them. They were stories that had ended, their finality preserved under spotlights. My story, and the one I now tended, was still being written. It was during the deep quiet of a 3 a.m. round that I first felt the pull. I was in the mineralogy wing, surrounded by glittering geodes and jagged crystals, when a wave of dizziness passed over me. The polished floor beneath my feet seemed to soften, and for a single, disorienting heartbeat, I smelled not dust and disinfectant, but the rich, loamy scent of turned earth. A faint, silvery path, like the trail of a snail, glimmered on the black marble before fading away. It was a call, not a desperate, angry summons like the one from Harvest's End, but a gentle, persistent tugging. Something was lost. Something small and frightened had slipped through a crack, and the balance was subtly askew. I knew better than to ignore it. I followed the feeling not out of the museum, but deeper into it, to the Hall of North American Forests. It was a diorama of a redwood grove, incredibly lifelike, with stuffed deer and a trickling stream. The feeling was strongest here. I stood before the glass, my own reflection, a pale ghost superimposed on the ancient trees. And then I saw her. Not in the diorama, but within it, a flicker of movement behind the painted backdrop of deeper forest. A little girl, no more than 5, with leaves in her hair and a dress made of woven reeds. She was not a ghost. She was something else, a creature of a living, breathing wood that was not part of this world. She was pressing her small hands against the inside of the glass, her eyes wide with a terror that was as old as the trees. The whispering from my balcony flowers was a soft murmur in my mind. Not a demand, but a guidance. I did not break the glass. That would have been a violence, an act of of the old story. Instead, I placed my own palm flat against the cool surface, mirroring her. I closed my eyes and pushed with the cold stillness inside me, not against the museum, but against the thinness of the veil between here and there. I thought of roots and quiet shadows, of the safe, deep silence of the woods at night. I felt a resistance, like pushing through a wall of thick cloth, and then a give. A scent of pine resin and damp moss flooded the sterile air. When I opened my eyes, the diorama was unchanged. The little girl was gone. A single, vibrant green leaf of a species not found in any North American forest lay on the fake forest floor inside the case. The balance was restored. The pull in my chest ceased. I picked up my flashlight and continued my round. No one would ever know. The morning cleaners would not notice the leaf. The day guards would suspect nothing. It was just another quiet night. But I knew the world is layered like pages in a book. Some stories are pressed between them forgotten. Others are still being inked. My apartment, with its silver-eyed flowers, is not a home. It is a way station, a sanctuary. I am the keeper of the threshold, the weaver of the quiet peace that comes after the scream. The city sleeps around me, dreaming its safe, ordinary dreams, unaware of the gentle gardener who walks in its shadows, mending the tears in their world. My watch continues. It is, I have come to understand, a forever kind of thing. The leaf remained in the diorama for 3 days. On the 4th morning, it was gone. Not removed by a cleaner S vacuum, but simply vanished, as if it had finally finished its journey home. A quiet satisfaction settled over me, a feeling far more fulfilling than any legal victory I had ever achieved. This was a different kind of order, a harmony restored in a frequency only I and the flowers could hear. Spring came to the city, a grimy, reluctant thaw. The parks sprouted crocuses through the cigarette butts. On my balcony, the dark flowers began to seed. The silver centers would release a fine, sparkling dust that clung to the afternoon light. The seeds themselves were tiny, black, and hard as pebbles. I collected them in a small wooden box, knowing they were not for me to plant. They were for passage, for payment, for closing a circle. The next call came not as a pull, but as a silence. A specific, localized pocket of unnatural quiet in the middle of a bustling subway station. The air grew still and cold around a forgotten maintenance door, its paint peeling and its lock rusted shut. People hurried past, oblivious, their noise swallowed by the dead zone. I placed my hand on the rusted metal. Behind it, I could feel a vast, dry, and sun-scorched emptiness, a thing made of dust, and hunger was trapped there, scratching weakly at the other side. It wasn't malicious, just terribly, eternally thirsty. It had wandered into a dead end between worlds. I took a single seed from my box and pressed it into the keyhole. I poured my will into it, not a command, but a direction. A map. I thought of cool, deep canyons and hidden oases, of a sun that was a comfort, not a scourge. The seed glowed with a faint, silver light for an instant, and then turned to dust. The silence broke. The sounds sounds of the station rushed back in. A faint, grateful sigh, like the wind over a desert, whispered from behind the door and then was gone. This is my life now. I walk the city's veins and arteries, a surgeon for its unseen wounds. The flowers on my balcony are my compass and my companions. They tell me where the fabric is worn thin, where a story has snagged and threatens to unravel. I do not hunt monsters. I guide lost things. I soothe agitated energies. I am a fixer of existential leaks. Sometimes I receive letters. They are never signed. A pressed fern from a rainforest. A smooth, gray stone from a riverbed. A feather the color of moonlight. Tokens of gratitude from the places I have helped. I keep them in the wooden box with the remaining seeds. I am tending my balcony one evening when I feel a familiar, yet long absent, chill. It is not a call for help. It is an observation, a notification. I look up across the city skyline towards the west, towards harvest's end. Something has shifted there. The long stalemate is over. A decision has been made. I do not know what they have chosen to plant in the soil of their freedom. I may never know. But the connection, thin as a spider's silk, remains. They are part of my story as I am part of theirs. The silver-eyed flowers rustle. Their sound a gentle, echoing whisper that carries on the city breeze. A breeze that now, and always, carries the faint, fertile scent of autumn. Tonight, the breeze brings a new scent. The sharp, clean fragrance of ozone after a lightning strike. It is a scent of resolution, of a chapter finally, truly closed. I look west and feel the subtle thread that connects me to that valley snap, not with violence, but with a quiet, clean finality. They have moved on. The soil of harvest's end is just soil again. The next morning, a new plant has sprouted in one of my pots. It is a slender shoot, its leaves a vibrant, unearthly green. I know, without knowing how, that it is a piece of that resolved story, a gift sent down the thread before it broke. It is not a watchful plant, not a dark flower. It is something new. I do not know what it will become. My work continues. The city is a living thing, and its hidden wounds are endless. A weeping in the steam tunnels, a shadow that dances too long in the alley behind the old theater. I mend what I can. The box of seeds is half empty now. The new plant grows with astonishing speed. In a week, it has produced a single, closed bud, wrapped in petals of pure white. It is the first pure color on my balcony. It does not whisper. It hums, a low, soft note of potential. I am watering it when the doorbell rings. Not the rustle of petals, but the actual electronic chime of my apartment. No one ever rings my bell. I set down the watering can and walk to the door, the familiar cold settling in my core, not in alarm, but in readiness. I do not look through the peephole. I simply open the door. A woman stands there. She is dressed in a practical, city-style coat, but her shoes are dusty, as if she has walked a long way on a dirt road. Her hair is streaked with gray, but her eyes are a clear, piercing blue. They are eyes that have seen a field of black-eyed Susans under an orange moon. She does not speak. She holds out her hand. On her palm rests a single, perfect apple, its skin a deep, blushing red. It is not a gift from a supermarket. It is heavy with the sun and the weight of a tree I have never seen. I understand. I turn and go to my wooden box. I take out one of the remaining dark seeds, a tiny, hard piece of my own story, and I place it in her waiting hand. Our fingers do not touch. She looks past me to the balcony, to the white bud on the new plant. A small, genuine smile touches her lips. Then she nods once, folds her fingers over the seed, and turns away. I watch her walk down the hall and disappear around the corner, her footsteps making no sound. I close the door. The exchange is complete. A story from my world for a story from hers. I pick up the apple. It is firm and cool in my hand. I do not know if it is safe to eat. I do not know what it will show me. I place it on my windowsill, where the morning light will touch it. The white bud on the new plant has begun to unfurl. I will wait. I am good at waiting. The city hums around me, a symphony of forgotten things and quiet mending. And I, its gardener, listen for the next note, the next whisper, the next seed that needs a place to grow. The apple on my windowsill did not rot. Days passed, then weeks, and its skin remained taut and glossy, its color a perpetual, deepening sunset. It became a fixed point in my apartment, a silent companion to the now blooming white flower. The flower had opened into a complex, layered bloom, like a rose, but more geometric. And its hum was a constant, barely audible tone that seemed to clean the air around it. I found I could think more clearly when sitting near it, the static of the city fading into a smooth, manageable stream. The woman with the dusty shoes did not return. Her visit was a punctuation mark, not the beginning of a new sentence. The balance felt different now, less about mending leaks and more about curation. The seeds in my box were fewer. The calls I felt were subtler, less desperate. It was as if the network of thin places was stabilizing, learning to hold its own shape. It was the apple that showed me the next step. I was cleaning the windowsill one afternoon, my cloth brushing against its smooth surface, when a vision flashed behind my eyes. Not a memory, but a live scene. A young man, no older than I was when I first found Harvest's End, was standing in a narrow alley between two brick buildings. He was clutching a small, worn journal to his chest, his face pale with a terror that was entirely human. He was not lost from another world. He was from this one, and he had just found something he was not meant to see. The vision was from the apple. It was showing me a tear about to happen, a human story threatening to veer into a territory that would break it. The man had stumbled upon a genuine grimoire, left in a forgotten storage locker, and his rational mind was fracturing under the proof of the impossible. He was a seam, and he was splitting. I did not hurry. I picked up the apple. It was warm now, as if from a sun I couldn't feel. I held it in my hand and walked out of my apartment, leaving the white flower humming on the balcony. I knew the alley. It was not far. He was still there, slumped against the wall, hyperventilating. The journal lay at his feet, its leather cover looking disturbingly like old skin. He flinched when he saw me, his eyes wild. "You are not going mad," I said, my voice calm and flat, the cold from within me spreading a stillness through the alley. "But the world is, and you have found a sharp piece of it." I knelt and picked up the journal. It vibrated with a low, angry energy. It was a thing of rules and demands, a ledger of debts. It did not belong in the hands of someone who still believed the world was safe. "I have to give it back," he stammered. He was a graduate student. I could see it now. History or literature. A seeker of facts, not truths. "No," I said, "you have to forget." I held the apple out to him. Its red surface seemed to swallow the dim light of the alley. "Eat this. It will show you a simpler truth." He was too terrified to refuse. He took the apple, his hands shaking, and bit into it. The crunch was obscenely loud in the quiet space. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in wonder. He was seeing something else entirely, a memory of a childhood orchard, perhaps, or a perfect, logical equation that explained the universe. Something his mind could accept. He took another bite, and then another, until only the core remained. He looked at me, his eyes clear, but dazed. "I was looking for my keys," he mumbled, confused. "I must have dropped them." "You did," I said, pointing to a set of keys a few feet away. "You found them." He nodded, a slow, grateful gesture, picked up his keys, and walked out of the alley, back into the sane, predictable world. He would remember nothing but a sudden craving for an apple, and the relief of finding his lost keys. The grimoire was quiet in my hand. Its energy was dormant, like a scolded dog. This was not a lost thing to be guided home. It was a dangerous tool that needed to be shelved. I knew where to put it. The museum had a special collection, items deemed too peculiar for public display. I would log it there. It would be a fact among other facts, its power neutralized by bureaucracy and a temperature-controlled room. I walked home, the book tucked under my arm. The apple was gone, its purpose served. On my balcony, the white flower pulsed softly, its hum a note of approval. I had not just mendied a tear. I had rewritten a sentence, turning a potential tragedy into a mundane anecdote. This was a new kind of gardening, pruning, shaping, ensuring the wild, true things did not overgrow and strangle the fragile, necessary fiction of a normal life. I placed the grimoire on my table. Tomorrow, I would take it to the museum. Tonight, I would sit and listen to the flower and wait for the next fruit to ripen. The grimoire sat on my kitchen table for 3 days. It was not an object of evil, but of strict and unyielding law, a lexicon of cosmic contracts. Leaving it in a drawer felt irresponsible, like storing a live wire next to the kindling of daily life. The white flower's hum remained steady, a neutral observer. On the 4th morning, I wrapped the book in plain brown paper and took it to the museum during the day, a place I usually avoided when it was filled with the chatter of school groups and tourists. I went to the administrative offices, a labyrinth of beige corridors far from the public halls. Dr. Eris, the head of special collections, was a man whose own energy was as dry and catalogued as the artifacts he kept. He looked at the parcel, then at me, his eyes magnified by thick glasses. "Another donation from your anonymous benefactor," he stated, not asked. His fingers, precise and careful, unwrapped the paper. He did not flinch when he saw the cover. He opened it, his gaze scanning the script that was not quite ink. His lips pursed. "Unusual. The provenance will be listed as unknown." "It is best that way," I said. He nodded, already turning to place the book in a reinforced case. It would be assigned a number, filed away between a shard of pottery that always felt warm and a music box that never needed winding, contained by taxonomy. It was the perfect prison. That evening, a second bud had formed on the white plant, a twin to the first. The balance was adjusting to my new role. I was not just a warden for lost things, but a librarian for the dangerous ones. The next call was not a vision from a fruit or a pull in my chest. It was a sound, a single, clear note from a bell that had no physical source, a tone that resonated in the back teeth and the hollow of my spine. It was a summons, but not to mend or to guide. It was a request for an audience. The sound led me to the city's botanical gardens after hours. I slipped through a gate left mysteriously unlatched and followed the ringing tone down paths lined with sleeping flowers. It ended at the Victorian glass house, a palace of steam and old glass. Inside, the air was thick and warm, smelling of wet earth and jungle blooms. In the center, on a bench surrounded by towering ferns, sat a man. He was dressed in an immaculate, if old-fashioned, suit. He was not a ghost. He was as solid as I was, but the air around him shimmered with a heat haze distortion. In his hand, he held a small, silver bell. He looked up as I approached. His eyes were the color of tarnished copper. "You are the new gardener," he said. His voice was the rustle of palm fronds. "We have been watching your work, the remediation, the curation. It is elegant." "Who is we?" I asked, the cold inside me forming a shield against the oppressive humidity. "A loose collective," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Those of us who have an interest in the stability of this particular crossroads. You have been tidying up the mess left by others. We appreciate it." I said nothing. The white flower's hum was a faint, steady thread in my mind, a reminder of my own center. "We have a proposition," he continued. "A position has become available. A keeper for one of the older, more foundational gates. It is a position of significant responsibility. It would mean leaving this city. Your current methods show promise." It was an offer. A promotion from a night watchman mending small tears to to a warden of a major threshold. It was everything my old self, the lawyer, would have craved. Prestige, power, a defined purpose within a hierarchy. I looked around the glass house, at the imported orchids and the carefully manicured bromeliads. They were beautiful, but they were captives, their wildness trimmed to fit a design. I thought of my balcony, of the dark flowers that held their own light, and the white one that hummed with potential. I thought of the autonomy I had carved from the chaos. "My garden is here," I said. The man's pleasant expression did not change, but the shimmer in the air around him intensified. The offer is not made lightly, nor is it often refused. "I understand," I said, "but my roots are here." He studied me for a long moment, his coppery eyes seeming to weigh the truth of my words. Then he gave a slow, almost regretful nod. "The path of the solitary gardener is a long one," he said, "and often lonely." The bell in his hand gave one last, silent tremor. The air stilled. The humidity broke. He was gone. I stood alone in the vast glass house. I had not just refused a job. I had declared my independence from powers I barely understood. I had chosen my own messy, personal plot of earth over a preordained post. It was a risk, but as I walked back out into the cool night air, I felt the rightness of it settle in my bones. The city was my garden. I would tend it my own way. The second white bud had begun to open. Story 3. The thought arrived in Brian's mind, not as a memory of his own, but as a cold, smooth stone deposited by a receding tide. He was standing in the foyer of the Blackwood house, his digital thermometer registering a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And the thought was this: the taste of candle smoke is thickest just before the wick drowns in its own wax. He did not know what it meant. He had never smoked a candle. The specificity of the sensation, however, the waxy, acrid taste of it, felt like a lived experience, one that did not belong to him. It was October 28th. Outside, the town of Harvest's End was draped in the gaudy funeral shroud of Halloween. Porches bristled with jack-o'-lanterns, their carved grins and scowls flickering with unnatural life in the deepening twilight. Skeletons, both plastic and plausibly real, dangled from leafless oak trees. The air carried the sweet, spicy scent of decay and cinnamon from nearby kitchens, a cloying mixture that seeped even through the sealed doors of the notorious mansion. Brian, a man who built his life on the bedrock of empirical data, dismissed the errant thought as synaptic static, a misfire born of fatigue, and the pervasive, seasonal suggestibility. "Baseline readings are stable," he announced, his voice flat and loud in the cavernous silence. He consulted his tablet, a glowing rectangle in the gloom. Emph nominal, temperature nominal, no auditory anomalies. Elmer, leaning against a newel post carved with leering gargoyles, snorted. He was a documentary filmmaker, a professional skeptic whose cynicism was his primary lens. Shocking. A big, empty, dusty house is big, empty, and dusty. can we get the spooky stuff started? I'd like to capture at least one floating candlestick for the folks at home before the witching hour." He gestured with his camera, its red recording light a malevolent cyclops eye. Alexandra did not look at him. She stood in the center of the foyer, her arms wrapped around herself, as if against a chill no one else could feel. Her presence was a quiet counterpoint to their technology, a human dowsing rod. "It's not empty," she whispered. Her voice was the rustle of dry leaves. "It's watching. It's always watching. And it's preparing." "Preparing for what?" Isidore asked. She was Brian's partner, an architectural historian whose role was to provide context, to ground the haunting in brick and mortar and human history. She ran a hand over the dark, oily wood of the wall, her fingers tracing the grain. The last recorded incident was in 1985. The Blackwood family, what was left of them, were removed. The house has been silent since. "It hasn't been silent," Alexandra corrected, her gaze fixed on the grand staircase that swept up into perfect darkness. "It's been waiting. It's almost time." "Time for what?" Elmer prodded, shoving the camera closer to her face. Alexandra finally turned her head, her eyes reflecting the weak light from Brian's tablet. For the door to open. "Halloween isn't just a date here. It's a threshold. And this house is the lock." The next 2 days were a slow, meticulous descent. Brian's equipment began to fail in subtle, insidious ways. Batteries drained at an accelerated rate, their power seeming to bleed into the cold air. Audio recorders captured not the clear EVPs he sought, but a low, constant hum, like the drone of a distant beehive, that seemed to vibrate in the teeth. On the evening of the 29th, he reviewed thermal footage from the main hall and saw, for a single frame, the distinct shape of a small, cold handprint appear on the back of Isidora's neck as she studied a floor plan. When he blinked, it was gone. Isidora, for her part, found her historical certainty eroding. The house's blueprints, which she had memorized, no longer seemed to match its internal geography. A corridor would appear where none was documented. A doorway would be found bricked up, only to be open and yawning the next time she passed. She spent an afternoon in the library, a room suffocated by dust and the smell of rotting paper, and discovered a ledger detailing the estate's harvests. The final entry, dated October 31, 1899, was not for pumpkins or corn. It was a single, chilling line, reaping, one soul unblemished. The ink was a rusty brown. Elmer remained relentlessly mocking, but his footage began to betray him. During a solo sweep of the second-floor bedrooms, his camera, while live streaming to a backup drive, captured a figure standing behind him in a tarnished mirror. It was a child in a vintage, moth-eaten skeleton costume, its mask a crudely painted skull. When Elmer turned, the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the child was still there, its head now tilted at an impossible angle. He deleted the file, blaming a lens flare, and his own sleep deprivation. He did not mention the faint, sugary smell of candy corn that lingered in the room for hours afterward, but it was Alexandra who endured the worst of it. The house spoke to her not in words, but in sensations. A wave of profound, childish loneliness in the nursery, a burst of manic, cruel laughter in the master suite, the sticky, sweet taste of caramel apples, followed by the coppery tang of blood. She felt the house's anticipation growing, a pressure building like a storm, focused on the coming night. On the afternoon of the 30th, she was found in the ballroom, staring at the massive, unlit hearth. Her hands were covered in black, fibrous pulp. "I was carving," she said, her voice distant. The pumpkin, it was full of these, instead of seeds. She held up a clump of the material. It was hair, human hair, dark and matted. Brian, ever the scientist, bagged it for analysis. But the thought returned to him, unbidden and alien. The knife went in so easily. The face was already inside, waiting to be let out. Halloween night arrived not as a celebration, but as an executioner's dawn. The sun set early, bleeding orange and purple behind the skeletal trees. In the town below, children in their costumes became a swarm of tiny ghosts and goblins. Their laughter carried on the wind, sounding to the 4 people in the Blackwood house like the shrieks of the damned. The boundary, as Alexandra had warned, was thinning. The air in the house grew thick, heavy, and cold. Their breath plumed before them in the beams of their flashlights. The hum was no longer just on the recorders. It was in the walls, in the floor, a subsonic thrum that resonated in their bones. They had gathered in the foyer, a futile attempt at solidarity. Elmer's camera was live, its light a trembling pool in the oppressive dark. His skepticism had finally shattered. He was silent, pale, his knuckles white on the camera grip. "It has a resonance," Brian said, his voice trembling slightly as he stared at his tablet, which now showed a chaotic dance of conflicting data. A localized temporal and psychic distortion, focused by the architectural geometry and amplified by the collective cultural energy of the holiday. The rituals, the costumes, the treats, the invocation of the dead, they ray not just symbolic here. They ray functional. They ray providing the power. "It has a door," Alexandra repeated, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was rocking gently on her heels, and they ray almost here. The ones who wear the real masks. A doorbell chimed, a cheerful, melodic sound that was horrifically out of place. It echoed through the silent house. They froze. No one should be here. The property was sealed. It chimed again, insistently. Isadora, driven by a reflex of normalcy, took a step toward the front door. "Dante," Brian and Alexandra said in unison. But it was too late. From outside came a chorus of small, high-pitched voices. "Trick or treat." Elmer swung his camera toward the door. Through the frosted glass, they could see the distorted shapes of figures standing on the porch. Small figures. Children. "It is a prank," Elmer breathed. But There was no conviction in his voice. The doorbell rang again. This time, a long, continuous peal that scraped against their nerves. Isadora, her hand shaking, reached for the heavy brass knob. As her fingers touched the cold metal, the door swung inward on its own, with a groan of aged hinges. They stood there on the threshold. 3 children. One was a ballerina in a tattered pink tutu, her face obscured by a porcelain mask with a fixed, serene smile. Another was a cowboy, a bandana hiding the lower half of his face, his eyes dark and empty. The third was the skeleton from the mirror, its costume identical to the one Elmer had seen. They held out pillowcases, not for candy, but gaping and dark. Trick or treat, they said again, their voices a perfect, soulless unison. The air that swept in from the October night was not cold. It was the breath of a tomb, carrying the smell of turned earth, rotting pumpkins, and burnt sugar. Behind the children, the world was not the familiar street of Harvest S End. It was a landscape of shadows and swirling fog, dotted with the distant orange glows of countless jack-o'-lanterns. The skeleton child pointed a bony finger past them, into the heart of the house. Brian turned. The foyer was gone. They were now standing at the entrance to the ballroom. The grand room was lit by 1,000 flickering candles, their smoke collecting in a thick haze near the ceiling. The hearth was a roaring blaze, and figures moved in the shadows, dancing to music that was not there. They were dressed in fine, antiquated clothing, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks of animals and grotesques. They moved with a stiff, jerky grace, like puppets on strings. The house had not just awakened. It had reverted. It was living its eternal Halloween. No, Isadora whispered, backing away. This isn't possible. The ballroom doors slammed shut, the boom echoing like a gunshot. The 3 trick-or-treaters were now inside with them. The ballerina tilted her head, the porcelain mask clicking softly. The house requires an offering, she said, her voice no longer that of a child, but something ancient and dry. It is the tradition. It is the harvest. Elmer screamed and raised his camera, not to film, but as a weapon. The cowboy child moved with impossible speed, a blur of denim and shadow. There was a sound like snapping twigs, and Elmer fell, his camera clattering to the floor, its light dying. The last thing it captured was the cowboy standing over him, pulling the bandana down to reveal not a mouth, but a dark, ragged hole. Brian grabbed Isadora's hand and ran. They fled through a servant-s passage, the house shifting around them, walls breathing, floors undulating like a ship's deck. The festive ballroom music twisted into a dissonant, shrieking cacophony that pursued them. They burst into the library, but it was no sanctuary. The books on the shelves were melting, their pages bleeding black ink that dripped to the floor and formed shifting, glyph-like patterns. Alexandra was not with them. She had not run. She stood in the center of the foyer, facing the 3 children. She was smiling, a tranquil, awful smile. "I understand now," she said. "I am not medium. I am the invitation. The skeleton child reached up and took her hand. Its touch was not bone, but the cold, waxy texture of a carved pumpkin stem. You are the new lock, it said. The door must be held open. Brian and Isadora found themselves in the basement, a place they had avoided, a low-ceilinged space of dirt and stone. The air was frigid and smelled of damp clay and old meat. In the center of the room stood a single, massive pumpkin. It was not carved. It was pulsing, as if something inside was struggling to get out. Isadora sobbed, clinging to Brian. What is it? What does it want? And Brian knew. The thought was not his own, but it was crystal clear now, a memory from the house itself. The ritual of Halloween. The costumed children, the offering of treats, the thin veil. The Blackwoods had not just celebrated the holiday, they had perfected it. They had turned their home into a permanent threshold, a way to keep the door ajar, to feed on the energy that bled through. But a door held open requires a guardian, a lock, a soul to anchor it. It is the final tradition, Brian said, his voice hollow. The lighting of the jack-o'-lantern. You don't carve the face. You find it. You release what is already inside. The pumpkin in the center of the room began to split. Not from the top, but from the front. A vertical fissure opening like a hungry mouth. From within, a soft, orange light spilled out, and with it, a wave of profound, cosmic loneliness that stole the breath from their lungs. The light was not warm. It was the cold, ancient light of a dying star. Isadora screamed as a root, thick and fibrous, erupted from the dirt floor and wrapped around her ankle, pulling her toward the glowing pumpkin. Brian fought, pulling at her, but more roots snaked up, coiling around his legs, his arms, holding him fast. He watched, helpless, as Isadora was drawn into the pulsing orange fissure. Her final sound was not a scream, but a sigh, like a candle being extinguished. The light within the pumpkin flared, then settled into a steady, malevolent glow. The jack-o'-lantern was lit. The roots released Brian. He collapsed to the dirt, his mind unraveling. The images came not as memories, but as invasive species. The taste of candle smoke. The feel of cold pumpkin guts, slick and stringy in his hands. The sound of his own laughter, high and childish, as he put on a mask that was now his face. He was no longer Brian, the scientist. He was the guardian, the lock. The thought that had surfaced in his mind in the foyer was not someone else's, it was his own, from a future that had now arrived. He sat up. The basement was gone. He was in the foyer. Outside, through the open door, he could see the normal street of Harvest S End, the last of the trick-or-treaters heading home, their parents calling them from warm, lit doorways. The house was silent, waiting. He walked to the door and closed it, the solid thud a full stop to the night. He turned. The house was his. He was the house. His mind, what was left of it, began to fold in on itself, collapsing backward through time, seeking a safer, simpler place. The data was gone. The skepticism was gone. The fear was gone. All that remained was the ritual, the waiting, and the deep, abiding knowledge of the door he was now bound to keep. He was 5 years old. He was sitting on the floor of a warm, bright kitchen that had not existed for a very long time. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air. His small, clumsy hands were buried in the cold, wet innards of a pumpkin. His father's strong, kind hands guided his, helping him carve. The knife went in smoothly, scraping, scooping. He was looking for the face. The face was always inside, waiting to be let out. He looked up at his father, who smiled down at him, and the face was a comforting, familiar blur. The orange glow from the candle inside was so warm. It was so very, very warm. And it was almost time. It was almost Halloween. He stayed there for a long time, in the warmth of the kitchen that was a memory. The feeling of the pumpkin's slick pulp under his fingernails was the only real thing. The rest was just noise, a distant storm he no longer had to weather. He was safe inside the memory, a perfect, unchangeable loop. He was the boy. The house was his home. The door was shut. A sound pierced the tranquility, sharp and metallic. It was the doorbell. The memory of the kitchen flickered, the warm light dimming for a second. The boy looked up from his pumpkin, his small face creased with a confusion that was not his own. The man, who was both Brian and not Brian, felt a cold dread seep into the edges of the warm memory. It was an intrusion, a wrong note in a perfect song. The doorbell rang again, 2 short, insistent chimes. He stood up. The linoleum floor of the kitchen felt solid beneath his feet, but when he looked down, he saw the dusty, wide plank floorboards of the foyer. The memory and the present were overlapping, a double exposure of reality. He was both the child and the guardian, the lock and the key. He walked to the front door. Through the frosted glass, he saw a shape, a single, small figure. He knew, with a certainty that felt as ancient as the house itself, that it was not a child from the town. The town was asleep now, the holiday over. This was something else, a late arrival, a straggler from the other side. He did not want to open the door. The ritual was complete. The offering had been made. The door was to remain shut until the veil thinned again next year. But his hand, moving as if guided by a will greater than his own, reached for the brass knob. It was cold, so cold it burned. He pulled the door open. On the porch stood a little girl. She wore a simple white dress, and her feet were bare and dirty. She held a small wicker basket. Her face was pale and serene, and her eyes were too old for her features. She did not speak. She simply held out her basket. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were 3 objects. A single long match, a lump of wax, dark and veined like a petrified organ, and a small white candle, pristine and unused. The taste of candle smoke flooded his mouth, thick and acrid, so potent he could almost see it. It was the taste of a wick drowning. The thought was his own, and it was a command. He took the basket from her. His fingers brushed against hers, and they were as cold as the doorknob, as cold as the grave. The girl smiled, a tiny, fleeting gesture, and then she was gone. Not vanished, but simply not there, as if she had been a trick of the light. He looked down at the basket in his hands. The ritual was not over. The harvest was not complete. The jack-o'-lantern in the basement was lit, but a candle needed to be tended. A flame needed to be guarded from the wind. He carried the basket into the heart of the house, his footsteps echoing in a silence that was now expectant. He did not go to the basement. He went to the ballroom. The grand space was empty now, the phantom dancers gone, the hearth cold and dark. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the boarded-up windows. In the center of the ballroom floor, he knelt. He placed the white candle on the dusty wood. He struck the match against the floorboards. It flared to life with a sputter, its flame a tiny, defiant sun in the immense darkness. He touched it to the wick. The candle caught, its flame steady and pure. He knew what to do. He picked up the lump of wax. It was soft in his hand, malleable, as if warmed by an internal heat. He began to drip the wax around the base of the candle, building a wall, a moat, a fortress to protect the fragile flame. Each drop sizzled as it hit the floor, sealing the candle in place. He worked methodically, his movements precise, his mind empty of everything but the task. The taste of smoke was a constant presence on his tongue now, a part of him. He was the guardian of the flame. He was the lock. He was the house. And as the first gray light of November first began to bleed through the cracks in the boards, he sat back and watched the candle burn, knowing his vigil had only just begun. The door was closed, but the candle was lit, and it would need to burn until the harvest came again. The flame did not flicker. It burned with an unnatural stillness, a needle of pure white light in the dusty gloom. Brian watched it, his consciousness a thin skin over the deep, cold well of the House-S memory. Hours bled into days, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had become a substance, thick and syrupy, measured only by the slow consumption of the wax. He did not need to eat. He did not need to sleep. His body was an afterthought, a vessel for the vigil. The only sensation was the taste of the candle smoke, a perpetual, comforting burn in the back of his throat. It was the taste of his purpose. Then a change. A subtle draft, cold and probing, snaked through the ballroom. It did not come from the boarded windows or the cold hearth. It came from the center of the room, from the space just above the candle. The flame wavered for the first time, bending to the left as if in a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. Brian's head snapped up. A low, guttural sound formed in his chest, a growl of pure instinct. The house around him seemed to tense, the walls leaning in, the shadows deepening. The draft was an intrusion, a threat. The flame bent again, this time dangerously low, the light shrinking to a desperate blue ember at the wick's tip. taste in his mouth shifted from smoke to the metallic tang of a snuffed wick, of impending failure. No, the word was not a thought, but a command that erupted from the foundation of the house itself. He lunged forward, not with his hands, but with his will. He felt the house's energy, a vast, dormant power, surge through him. He focused it on the candle, building an invisible bell jar around the struggling flame. The flame righted itself, flaring back to its full, steady height. The white light seemed to brighten, pushing back against the oppressive dark of the ballroom. The probing draft recoiled, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The threat was gone, for now, but the event had left a mark. The perfect, warm memory of the kitchen was gone, burned away by the intensity of the defense. Brian was fully in the present, fully the guardian. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were clean. There was no pumpkin pulp, no slick seeds. There was only the faint, shimmering residue of the energy he had just channeled. He understood. The candle was not just a symbol. It was the seal. The lock required a constant, active guardianship. The things on the other side, the ones who wore the real masks, were not simply waiting for the veil to thin. They tested it. They probed for weaknesses. They sought to blow out the light. A new memory, cold and sharp, slotted into place in his mind. It was not his memory. It was the house he saw a line of figures, not the costumed children of Halloween, but the previous guardians. A woman in a Victorian dress, her eyes hollow. A man in workman-esque clothes, his hands scarred. Isadora, her face a mask of tranquil acceptance. Each had sat in this vigil. Each had tended the flame. Each had eventually failed. The candle was not eternal. The wax would run out. The guardian would falter. And when it did, the door would swing wide, and the harvest would begin anew, seeking a new soul to become the next lock. Brian looked at the steady white flame. He felt no fear, no regret. There was only the purpose. He was the guardian, the lock, the house. He settled back into his watch, his eyes fixed on the light, a sentinel in the silent, waiting dark. The candle burned. The door was closed, and he would make sure it stayed that way. The silence that followed was deeper than before, a held breath after a narrow escape. Brian's senses, now fused with the house, stretched out like fine threads into every dusty corner, every mouse-chewed beam. He could feel the weight of the years in the attic, the damp sorrow in the cellar, the latent, patient hunger in the walls. The candle was the heart of it all, and he was its keeper. A soft, scratching sound began at the edges of his awareness. It was not the scampering of an animal. It was a deliberate, rhythmic scraping, like a fingernail on old wood. It came from the wall behind him. He did not turn. He did not need to. His perception flowed through the plaster and lathe into the narrow space between the walls. There, in the darkness, something was writing. He felt the pressure of each mark as it was carved into the wood, the splinters lifting. It was a single word, repeated over and over, a frantic, fleeting message from a previous occupant of his role. Remember, remember, remember. But he did not want to remember. Remembering was a pain that threatened the purity of his vigil. He pushed the sensation away, sealing that part of the wall with a thought. The scratching ceased, replaced by a faint, defeated weeping that was quickly swallowed by the house's immense silence. The flame of the candle flickered again, not from a draft, but in response to his moment of distraction. A tiny spark, a fragment of its light, popped from the wick and landed on the dusty floorboard. Instead of dying, it glowed, a single brilliant ember. It pulsed, and with each pulse it grew, pulling the dust and shadows around it, taking form. A figure coalesced from the light and the grime. It was Isidora, not as she was at the end, but as she had been when they first entered the house, full of a nervous, scholarly energy. She looked at him, her eyes wide and real. Brian, her voice was a whisper, a perfect imitation of hope. Brian, can you hear me? We have to get out. We have to break the cycle. The part of him that was still Brian, a tiny, buried shard of the man he had been, twisted in agony. The illusion was perfect. It was everything he had lost. "It's a trick, Brian," the Isidora figure pleaded, taking a step closer. Her hand reached out, warm and alive. "The house shows you what you want to see to make you lower your guard. It needs your compliance. It feeds on your hope." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to take her hand and run from this ballroom, from this vigil, from the taste of eternal smoke. The candle flame dipped, softening, its white light warming to a gentle yellow. The darkness in the room receded slightly. The Isidora figure smiled, a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. That's it. Just let it go. And in that smile, he saw it. A flicker, not of light, but of something else. A glimpse of the orange, pulsing glow of the pumpkin from the basement deep within her eyes. It was not Isidora. It was the house, wearing her memory, offering him a different kind of trap. Compliance, not through force, but through surrender. A cold, ancient fury rose in him. It was not his fury, but the house's own protective rage. How dare it use his pain? How dare it mimic his loss? "No," he said. His voice was the creak of the floorboards, the groan of the rafters. The Isidora figure's smile vanished, replaced by a placid porcelain blankness. Its form shuddered, then dissolved, not into nothingness, but back into the single, white-hot ember from which it came. The ember flew back to the candle wick, rejoining the flame with a soft sigh. The light blazed white and cold once more, harder and more resolute than before. The attempt had failed. The house had tested its new lock and found it secure. Brian felt a grim satisfaction. The memory of Isidora was now just fuel, another piece of kindling added to the fire of his purpose. He was the guardian, the lock, the house. He looked at the candle. The wax had burned down by a fraction of an inch. The vigil continued. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the sentinel in the dark, tending the flame that kept their reality separate from the feast of shadows that waited just on the other side of the door. The days began to blend, marked only by the slow, steady shortening of the candle. Brian's body became a statue in the dust, his breathing so shallow it barely stirred the air. He was a conduit, a living part of the house's architecture, his consciousness woven into the very grain of the wood. The taste of smoke was his sustenance, the white flame his only reality. Then a new sensation pricked at his awareness. It was not a draft or a phantom. It was a vibration, a faint, rhythmic thumping that came from the front of the house. It was the sound of a fist knocking on the front door. The sound was wrong. It was too solid, too real. It belonged to the world outside the vigil. It was a disruption in the sacred silence. The flame of the candle did not flicker, but Brian felt a tremor run through the foundation of the house. His head, which had not moved in what felt like centuries, tilted slightly. His eyes, dry and stinging, remained fixed on the flame, but a part of his perception split off and traveled down the hall to the foyer. Through the frosted glass of the front door, he saw the blurred shape of a man, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette. The man knocked again, harder this time. The sound was like a hammer blow against Brian's own skull. "Hello," a voice called, muffled but clear. It was a deep, concerned voice. "Is anyone in there? Your door was open all night. Just checking to see if everything's okay." It was a neighbor, a man from Harvest's End, performing a simple, human act of kindness. The normality of it was a corrosive acid on Brian's resolve. It threatened to remind him of a life where doors were for visitors, not for sealing away horrors. The man tried the doorknob. Brian felt the brass mechanism turn, a cold, metallic sensation in his own palm. The lock, ancient and strong, held fast. "Weird," the man muttered to himself. Brian could hear him perfectly, his hearing now supernaturally acute within the house's boundaries. "Place has been empty for years. Could have sworn I saw a light." The man's shadow shifted as he peered through the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes. For a terrifying second, Brian thought their eyes might meet through the obscuring film. The part of him that was still Brian screamed in silent warning. "Go away. Please, just go away." The house agreed. The threat was not the man himself, but the connection he represented to the outside. The flame of the candle could not be exposed to that kind of simple, rational world. It would break the spell. It would weaken the lock. Brian, acting with the house's instinct, pushed a thought toward the door. It was a simple, primal command, woven from loneliness and despair, and the cold light of a dying star. "Leave. There is nothing for you here. You are not welcome. You are forgotten." On the porch, the man shivered violently, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. The cheerful concern on his face melted into a vague, unsettled confusion. He took a step back, looking at the door as if he couldn't quite remember why he was there. Must have been the wind, he mumbled, shaking his head. He turned and walked briskly down the path, not looking back. The intrusion was over. The silence rushed back in, deeper and more absolute than before. Brian let out a breath he did not need to hold. The flame burned undisturbed, but the event had changed something. The house had spoken to the outside world, and a thread, however fine, now connected them. The vigil was no longer perfectly pure. The lock had been tested not by the things from below, but by the world above. And Brian knew, with a cold certainty, that the world above would not stay away forever. The candle was burning, and its light, however contained, was a beacon. Someone would eventually come to investigate a light in a forgotten house. His watch was not just against the dark within, but against the light without. The thought was a new weight, a fresh layer of responsibility. He was not only guarding the flame from the things that wished to extinguish it, but also from those who might, with the best of intentions, stumble upon it. The world's ignorance was its protection, and his. He focused on the candle, pouring his will into reinforcing the silence around the house. He wove threads of neglect and disinterest, of vague unease and forgotten paths. He made the house a little more invisible, a little less substantial to any who might glance its way. The dust in the air thickened. The boards on the windows seemed to warp just enough to block any sliver of light from escaping. Days turned, marked by the slow, inexorable consumption of the wax. The white pillar was now half its original height. Brian felt a corresponding diminishment within himself. The memories of his past life were distant, faded photographs. The man who had been Brian was now merely a flavor in the house's consciousness, a unique note in its ancient song. He was the guardian, nothing else. A new sensation began to bloom, faint at first, then growing stronger. It was a pulling, a gentle but persistent tug from the direction of the basement. The jack-o'-lantern. Its work was done, its purpose served, but its connection to him, to the house, remained. It was a guttering ember in the cellar's dark, and it was calling to the steady flame of the candle. He understood. The two lights were not meant to exist separately for long. The ritual was a single entity, split into two acts: the offering and the seal, the harvest and the lock. They needed to be reunited to complete the cycle, to fully secure the door until the next turning of the year. The thought of moving was alien. His body had become stone, his joints fused with disuse. But the house's will was his own, and it demanded this final consolidation. With a groan of protesting muscles and splintering wood, he rose to his feet. The dust fell from him in sheets. He stood, a tall, pale figure in the gloom, and looked down at the candle. Its flame burned straight up, a silent, waiting signal. He knelt again, not in reverence, but in necessity. He carefully pried the candle from its waxen fortress. It came free with a soft crack, the cooled wax releasing its hold on the floorboards. He cupped it in his hands, feeling its fragile warmth its immense significance. Holding the candle before him like a priest with a sacrament, he turned and walked from the ballroom. His footsteps were slow and heavy, each one echoing through the silent halls. He passed the grand staircase, the closed parlor doors, the spot in the foyer where he had last seen Isadora as herself. The memories were there, but they had no power over him now. They were just rooms. He descended into the basement. The air was colder here, thick with the scent of damp earth and the cloying, sweet smell of rotted pumpkin. The orange glow from the jack-o'-lantern pulsed in the darkness, a sickly, rhythmic heartbeat. He approached the workbench. The pumpkin sat where he had left it, its carved smile a grimace in the flickering light. The flame within was low, drowning in its own melted wax, just as he had known it would be. He did not hesitate. He brought the white candle forward, and with a precise motion, he touched its pure, steady flame to the dying. Orange won inside the pumpkin. There was no explosion, no burst of light. Instead, the orange flame sighed out, extinguished instantly by the superior fire. For a single, terrifying second, there was only the white candle in his hand, its light a lonely island in the profound blackness of the cellar. Then the white flame leaned over, like a curious child, and dipped into the hollow of the pumpkin. It touched the blackened wick within. A new fire erupted. It was not orange, nor was it white. It was a color he had no name for, a deep, shifting violet shot through with silver. It burned clean and silent, without smoke, and the sweet-rotten smell vanished, replaced by the odor of cold stone and ancient, patient power. The door was sealed, truly sealed. The lock was engaged. Brian placed the white candle inside the pumpkin, next to the new, strange flame. The two lights burned side by side, the violet silver and the pure white, a perfect, balanced pair. The harvest was complete. The guardian was in place. He stood before the workbench, his task finished. He had no need to return to the ballroom. His vigil was here now, in the dark, with the twin flames. He was the lock. The key was burning. And he would wait, a sentinel in the silent earth, until the world turned and the veil grew thin once more. The silence in the basement was different from the silence upstairs. It was older, heavier, the quiet of deep roots and buried things. Brian stood before the workbench, his form a pale pillar in the light of the twin flames. The violet silver fire from the pumpkin and the steady white flame of the candle existed in perfect harmony, their light casting no shadows, but instead filling the cellar with a flat, even illumination that left no place for darkness to hide. He felt the house settle around him, its ancient tensions easing. The probing, hungry presence on the other side of the door had retreated, its attention withdrawn for another season. The lock was holding. He had done it. But with the immediate threat gone, a new awareness began to seep into him, slow and cold as groundwater. It was the awareness of his own state. He looked at his hands, pale and long-fingered, resting at his sides. He tried to recall the feeling of Isadora's hand in his, the warmth of her skin. The memory was there, but it was like reading a description in a book. The sensory truth of it was gone. He was not aging. He was not hungry. He was not thirsty. His body was a vessel, and the only thing that flowed through it was the will of the house. He was a fixture, as permanent and unchanging as the foundation stones. The thought should have been terrifying, but the part of him that could feel terror had been sealed away. Another compartment in the vast, silent architecture of his being. His gaze drifted from the flames to the stone wall behind the workbench. He had not noticed it before, his attention wholly consumed by the ritual. But now he saw the markings. They were faint, etched into the stone with a nail or a shard of glass. Names, dates, a simple, grim ledger. Eleanor, 1898. Thomas, 1925. Isadora, 1987. His own name was not there. Not yet. He understood. The inscription would come later, when his vigil was complete. When the wax of the candle was finally spent, and the flames guttered out, the door would open, the harvest would begin, and a new name would be added to the wall. He was not the first. He would not be the last. A soft sound reached him, not through his ears, but through the stones themselves. It was the crunch of gravel on the drive, the careful footsteps of someone approaching. Another visitor. The world outside was not done with him. He did not move. He did not need to. His presence was enough. He felt the moment the visitor, a woman this time, saw the light emanating from the basement window well. He felt her hesitation, a spike of curiosity laced with fear. He pushed the house S will against her, the same command he had given the man before. Leave. Forget. But this one was different. She was older, her roots in this town deeper. She did not shiver and walk away. She stood her ground, and a different memory rose in her, one the house had not counted on. A story her grandmother had told her about the old house on the hill and the light that burned in the cellar on years when Halloween fell on a full moon. A story about the guardian. Brian felt a crack in the perfect silence. Her knowledge, her remembering, was a flaw in the veil. It was a tiny thing, but in the eternal watch against the dark, any flaw was a danger. He made a decision. It was not his decision, not Brian S., but the house S., and he was the house. He could not let her leave with that memory intact. He turned from the workbench and walked to the cellar stairs, his movements smooth and silent. He did not open the door. He simply passed through it, the wood offering no more resistance than mist. He stood in the overgrown garden, the cold autumn air feeling like nothing on his skin. The woman saw him and froze, her eyes wide. She was holding a phone, its light a jarring, modern intrusion. Brian looked at her, and for the first time he spoke aloud. His voice was the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone. There is nothing for you here. He did not threaten her. He did not need to. He simply showed her. He He let her see the truth in his eyes, the endless vigil, the consuming fire, the slow erosion of a soul. He let her feel the immense, crushing weight of the responsibility she was so close to stumbling upon. The phone fell from her nerveless fingers. The curiosity and fear in her eyes were replaced by a profound, soul-deep understanding, and then by a desperate, urgent need to forget. She turned and ran, stumbling through the weeds, back toward the safe, ignorant lights of Harvest S End. Brian watched her go. He had not harmed her. He had simply given her a truth too heavy to carry, and she had gladly let it go. The flaw was mended. The silence was restored. He returned to the cellar, to his place before the twin flames. The wax had burned a little lower. The vigil continued. He was the guardian, the lock, the house, and he would wait. The woman-s flight was a brief, sharp disturbance in the fabric of the night, and then it was gone. The house absorbed the memory of her terror, filing it away with the others. Brian felt the structure around him grow stronger for it, the walls drinking the fear and converting it into resolve. The lock was not just a thing of flame and will, but of sacrifice, and every encounter with the outside world was another small offering. He returned his gaze to the twin flames. They were his entire universe now, the focal point of all existence. The white candle and the violet silver fire from the pumpkin were not just burning, they were conversing in a silent, flickering language. He began to understand its rhythms. The white flame spoke of containment, of borders and definitions. The violet flame spoke of the deep, formless dark beyond the door, not as an enemy, but as a natural force to be managed, like the sea held back by a levee. He was the levee. Time became a river of wax. He watched a single droplet form swell, and then trace a slow, glistening path down the side of the candle, before solidifying into a new layer of history. He did not sleep. His eyes remained open, fixed on the light, but his vision turned inward. He saw the house not as a building, but as a living system. The roots of the foundation were his nerves. The wiring in the walls was his circulatory system, dormant now, but waiting. The ancient plumbing was his digestive tract, empty and still. A pressure began to build in the cellar, a subtle shifting in the atmosphere. It was not a threat from beyond the door. It was the house itself, adapting to its new, permanent guardian. The air grew colder, and a sheen of frost, delicate as lace, began to form on the stone walls. It crawled upward from the floor, intricate patterns blooming in the ice. They were not random. They were sigils of binding, of watchfulness, of silence. The house was inscribing its purpose into the very environment, and Brian was the center point. He felt the cold, but it did not chill him. It was a part of him. The frost touched his shoes, then climbed his trousers, a crystalline skin forming over the worn fabric. It did not stop. It crept up his torso, over his hands clasped before him, up his neck. He did not resist. This was integration. This was permanence. The ice reached his face. He felt its gentle, final kiss on his skin, and then his vision was obscured by a thin, perfect pane of frost. He could still see the flames, but they were now two blurred stars in a frozen sky. He could not move his limbs. He could not blink. He was entombed within the house will, a statue of ice and purpose. This was the final step. The guardian was no longer a temporary occupant. He was a feature of the house, as immutable as the hearth or the roof. His consciousness remained sharp and clear, focused entirely on the balance of the flames. He could feel the slow, steady beat of the house's heart through the ice that encased him. Thump, thump. It was the rhythm of the turning earth, the countdown to the next thinning of the veil. From his frozen prison, he perceived a new development. The world outside was continuing its relentless cycle. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. He heard the first drop hit the roof, a single, hesitant tap, then another. And then the sky opened, and a downpour drummed against the old shingles and boarded windows. It was a storm, a real one, not a phantom of the house's making. Water began to seep into the basement. It started as a trickle, finding its way through a crack in the foundation mortar. It pooled on the floor, a dark, expanding stain in the dust. Then another trickle started, and another. The house, for all its power, was still a physical structure, subject to the decay of the world it sought to shut out. The water inched across the floor toward the workbench, toward the flames. A jolt, the first true emotion he had felt since the frost took him, shot through Brian's still heart. It was not fear for himself. It was a pure, undiluted terror for the fire. The lock. If the water reached the flames, if it extinguished them before the year's turn, the house shuddered around him. The frost on the walls glistened, and he felt a massive effort of will. The trickles of water slowed, then stopped, as the house shifted its own foundations, a minute contraction of stone and earth that sealed the leaks. But the water already on the floor continued its slow, inevitable advance. It was a quarter of the way to the workbench. The house could not make it disappear. It could only try to contain it. Brian stared at the shimmering path of the water, then back at the flames. The wax was 2/3 gone. There was so much time left, and now this. The vigil had become a race not just against time, but against the indifferent elements. The outside world was not just knocking at the door anymore. It was leaking through the walls. The water was a patient, mindless adversary. It did not rush. It seeped and pooled and slowly, inexorably, mapped the contours of the uneven stone floor. Brian watched its progress through the lens of ice, his consciousness a pinpoint of absolute focus. The twin flames flickered, their light reflecting in the growing, dark mirror on the floor. The violet-silver flame seemed to pulse a little faster, sensing the approach of its elemental opposite. The house strained around him. He felt the groan of timber and the grind of stone as it attempted to warp the floor, to create a subtle depression that would draw the water away from the workbench. A shallow channel began to form in the dust, leading toward a long, dry drain in the corner. But the water was stubborn. It followed the path of least resistance, which was a slow, flat creep directly toward the bench legs. A drop fell from a ceiling beam, landing with a sharp plink in the center of the largest puddle. The sound was a violation in the sacred silence. The circle of ripples expanded, touching the edge of the channel the house had made. The water hesitated, a fraction of it diverting into the new path, but the main body continued its advance. Brian could not move his body, but his will was the house's will. He pushed it against the water, not to stop it, which was impossible, but to guide it. He poured the concept of thirst into the stones beneath the water. He imagined the foundation as a great, dry sponge. For a moment, it worked. The leading edge of the puddle seemed to shrink, the dark stain receding by an inch as the porous stone drank greedily. But the rain outside was relentless. More water found its way in, a fresh trickle from a new crack. The puddle grew again, reclaiming the lost ground, and then some. The house's thirst was finite. The storm's supply was not. The water was now a hand's breadth from the nearest leg of the workbench. Brian could see the individual dust motes floating on its surface. He felt a profound helplessness, a spectator to his own failure. The lock was going to be broken by something as mundane as a leaky basement. Then a new thought, cold and sharp, cut through the panic. It was not his thought. It was the house's, born from a deeper, older memory than his own. The guardian was not just a watchman. He was a tool, a component. The frost that encased him was not merely a prison. It was a resource. He focused his entire being on his right hand, the one closest to the advancing water. He did not try to move the flesh and bone, but the ice itself. He commanded it to grow, to extend, to bridge the gap between his frozen pedestal and the floor. A crack sounded, a sound like a breaking bone. A spear of pure, clear ice shot out from the casing around his hand. It was not a random shard, but a controlled, purposeful extrusion, a crystalline limb. It touched the wet stone floor with a faint hiss. The water recoiled from the touch of the supernatural cold. A film of new ice, white and fragile, spread from the tip of the spear, crawling over the surface of the puddle. It was not enough to stop it, but it slowed it, creating a fragile, freezing dam. Brian held the extension, pouring his will into it. He was cannibalizing his own form, using the very substance that made him permanent to buy a few more hours, a few more days. The frost on his body thinned slightly over his right side, the price of the effort. The water pressed against the icy barrier, and the barrier held. The flames on the workbench burned on, their light steady. The rain continued to drum its fists on the roof, but the immediate threat was checked. The vigil had changed again. It was no longer a passive watch. It was an active battle of attrition, a slow drain against an endless siege. He was melting himself to keep the fire burning. He He watched the water, he watched the flames, and he felt the slow, steady dissolution of his own form. The wax was burning down. The ice was melting. 2 countdowns, now running in parallel. He wondered which would reach 0 first.